Chapter 18 of Ghosts I Have Seen and Other Psychic Experiences by Violet Tweedale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 18 Haunted Rooms. How is it that one can feel a room is haunted? What is it that gives one the strong impression that there is something unpleasant about a certain room, a something that sets it apart as a place to be avoided? The mind operates with the senses. It receives impressions through the air as sound, or through the ether as sight, and so forth. Through the various senses, we catch the vibrations of consciousness belonging to our environment, near or far. Psychically developed persons possess an increase of sensibility, which enables them to see, hear, and feel more accurately than most people. Wherever some great mental disturbance has taken place, wherever overwhelming sorrow, hatred, pain, terror, or any kind of violent passion has been felt, an impression of a very marked character has been imprinted on the astral light. So strong is this impression that often persons possessing but the first glimmer of the psychic faculty are deeply impressed by it. But a slight temporary increase of sensibility would enable them to visualize the whole scene. That such impressions should be imprinted on the astral light is no more wonderful than ordinary photography, or the impression of the human voice upon the cylinders of a gramophone. To me, a haunted room is always full of shadows. That is how I see it. That is one of several ways by which I distinguish it from other rooms. Other people do not always see these shadows, and the room may actually be flooded with sunshine when I enter it for the first time. This makes no difference to what I see. The shadows are there, despite the sunshine. There are long drawn-out shadows which seem to take their rise in the corners of the room and creep across the floor. They are not motionless, but in constant vibration and reformation like smoke drifts. Such shadows are not of a uniform gray, but tinged by dull colors, dark red, sulphur yellow, muddy brown. In a haunted room, there's always a shadow above one's head, a hovering cloud between the ceiling and midway to the floor. Then there are the sensations I feel when entering a haunted room. Little shivers run through me, and what I take to be nervous excitation sets all my spine jangling, and the tiny nerve threads quivering. The sensation of icy cold water trickling down my back is most unpleasant. At times a profound melancholy falls upon me, often blended with a poignant compassion for someone I know not whom. At other times a sensation of violent repulsion invades my being, which has actually in some cases produced physical sickness. Again, there is the helpless feeling, and that is the hardest to bear of all such psychic disturbances, the feeling that something is about to occur in that room which I will be powerless to ward off. What can one do when paying a visit if one is ushered into a bedroom by one's hostess, which one instantly knows to be unhealthful? I cannot find a better word to describe many a haunted room. This experience has several times happened to me, and unless I know my hostess very well, I am obliged to sleep in this unhealthful atmosphere. On one occasion, I was invited to dine and sleep with some old friends who had taken a lease on an old castle in the neighborhood of St. Andrews, where I happened to be staying. They had only been in residence for a month or two, an old brother and old sister whom I had known all my life. In spite of this long friendship, they were not the sort of people to whom I could have said, "Would you mind giving me another room? The one you have selected for me is haunted, and if I remain in it, I will have no sleep. I shall not even dare to try to sleep, but shall have to keep awake all night to ward off the evil. They would have been both shocked and indignant at such a suggestion, and probably have concluded that I had gone stark, staring mad. I had accepted a seat in a carriage belonging to some friends in St. Andrews, who were also going to the castle to dine, but who were returning to sleep in their own homes in town. It was twilight when we drove up the long avenue and caught a first glimpse of the exterior. A typical old Scotch castle, very large, with high-peaked roofs and pepper-box turrets, and all built of grey stone. About an hour before dinner, I was conducted to my room. My evening dress was already spread upon the bed, and the housemaid was arranging my toilet articles on the dressing-table. "I think you will be comfortable here, my dear," said my kind hostess, and I thanked her with a sinking heart as she went away. As the housemaid prepared to follow her, I said, "Am I the only person sleeping on this floor?" She answered, "You are the only one in this wing, miss." "It is a very large house, I suppose?" 26 bedrooms, answered the housemaid, "but we've shut up most of them. This is the one with such a good view that Miss Young thought it ought to be used." With that she went away, and I looked round. 6 lighted candles and a big wood fire seemed to only accentuate the profound gloom and oppression of the large, irregular room. The very first thing I did was to throw a towel over the face of the mirror on the dressing-table. Then I investigated every nook and corner. There was a powdering closet formed in a pepper-box turret. The carpet of the room stopped short at its door, and inside the boards looked loose and uneven. I fetched a candle and soon discovered that the floorboards lifted up quite easily, and beneath them was a yawning black hole, an oubliette, through which wretched prisoners were cast in days not so long ago. I replaced the boards, telling myself that in the morning I would have a look at the outside of this black shaft. It probably ended, as most such places did end in the old Scotch castles, in a big dungeon underground. Inside my room there were sloping ceilings and great beams, and an enormous fireplace that had been bricked up to suit more modern requirements. There were 2 doors, the one I had entered by, and another which was locked and keyless. The window, with the view, was hidden by heavy red curtains, and the atmosphere was musty and dank, like that of a vault. As I stared around me, I could not help thinking what an unfortunate thing it is to be born without any imagination. Anyone possessed of a spark of that quality would have hesitated before putting a young guest into so gloomy a chamber, the only room occupied in that wing. No sleep possible here, I told myself grimly, as I began to dress. Then I set myself to feel after what was really wrong with the room. Supposing I did fall asleep, what would happen? Would someone come and try to strangle me in the night? That had actually happened to many people. Would I suddenly awake to the fact that someone unseen was pulling off the bedclothes? That was also a trick common to ghostly visitants. Gradually I gathered impressions, very unpleasant ones. I became positively certain that I was being watched intently. Someone present in the room, though unseen by me, was watching my every movement. That someone violently resented my occupation of the room, was intensely hostile, and meant to make things nasty for me later on that night. Wherever I moved, I felt that malignant eyes followed me, and I kept glancing over my shoulder at every crack of the furniture and the scratching of a mouse in the wainscot. It was in the stretches of dead silence that the presence became most imminent, most menacing, and I had a strong instinct to set my back against the wall and face right out into the room. Again I was confronted by the mirror problem. I had become certain that it must remain covered. If I looked into its surface, I knew I would see something horrible. Something kept whispering to me, "Never mind how you look. Never mind if your bodice is all awry, or your skirt all askew, or your hair all bulging out on one side. Don't uncover the mirror if you value your sanity. What there is to be seen can only become visible in the mirror. Don't worry after explanations, or why this, or how could it be. Do as I tell you, keep the mirror covered, and when you come up to bed, keep your back to the wall." Dressing was a very rapid process that night, and when completed, so far as circumstances would allow, I found I still had 20 minutes to wait until the dinner gong would ring. I sat down with my back against the wall and surveyed the depressing apartment with a gloomy anticipation. Where was that stealthy watcher whose baleful eyes I felt were fixed upon me? I could see nothing. I could only feel acutely that I was not alone, and that I was in for an awful night. Oh, to get away and leave that malignant, unseen watcher in undisputed possession of his dismal abode! I was quite certain of the gender. Then a chance of deliverance flashed over me. I could return after dinner to St. Andrew's with the friends who had brought me, but I had accepted the invitation to stay the night. What possible excuse could I make for cutting short my visit? In this case, the truth was no use, in fact, worse than useless. Not only would my host and hostess utterly fail to understand what I was talking about, but they would be exceedingly indignant and look upon me as absolutely insane. As falsehood had to be resorted to, I surely could invent some plausible excuse that would hurt no one's feelings. But the only excuse I could think of was illness. I must tell my hostess that I feared I was in for an illness of some sort, and the wisest thing to do was to drive back to St. Andrew's and be laid up in my own bed. The most hospitable person would rather not have a sick guest under her roof. The excuse I proposed to make seemed to me to be the one most likely to be accepted without much fuss. I did not determine upon this plan without a certain amount of wavering. After all, I told myself, it is only for one night, and what can this entity do but give you a very creepy and disturbed night? You will have to sit up against a wall and defend yourself by the power of the cross, bidding it be gone in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. This you may have to do many times, but the night won't last forever, and you had best try to make the best of things and not risk offending old friends. It did seem hard that I dared not tell the truth. Had the entity been in the flesh, how easy it would have been. Who has not at some time or another in her life found herself unwittingly to be an unwelcome guest, and made to feel, if you don't go away at once, you will regret it? Sometimes one comes across persons who, for some private reason, dread being overlooked, or who love their hermitage so dearly that they refuse to be amiable to even the most swiftly passing guest. Old people are often like that. Everyone knows or has known of such people in the flesh. Yet how few believe that such unpleasant traits persist just as strongly after so-called death as before. What should suddenly change a man's whole disposition the moment he shuffles off this mortal coil? I felt I was now in the presence of one who dreaded being overlooked, and who sought to get rid of me by every device in his power. Whilst thinking thus, my mind was irrevocably made up for me. My attention was suddenly drawn towards a soft, stealthy noise, padded footsteps. Something had come near and was creeping warily round in front of me. I felt the eyes upon me. I was being regarded more closely. What was about to follow? I leapt to my feet, and raising my arm, made the sign of the cross. I bid you be gone, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. There was a moment's pause of utter silence. The atmosphere struck suddenly chill as ice. A curious sensation of emptiness crept over the room. I was alone, but for how long would I remain alone? I hurried downstairs and tried to play my part, and during the course of the evening I told my falsehoods as naturally as I could. At 10:30 I drove off to St. Andrew's with a light heart and an utter indifference to the consequences. I believe my falsehoods did not, however, go down, for I never was asked again to that house. Perhaps it was as well, for I certainly never would have set foot in it again, and I had sacrificed the truth quite sufficiently upon this one occasion. I had no difficulty in finding out what sort of reputation the castle bore. Everyone agreed that it was haunted. I asked one elderly woman who had lived all her life in St. Andrews, and who knew the whole country intimately, what she thought of Castle. Horrible, haunted old place. I can't think how the Youngs could have taken it, she replied. But what sort of ghosts haunted? I asked. Old Sir James and his son. They were in league with the devil, and the son, another James, used to murder people and throw them down into the dungeon. He was beheaded in the reign of Charles I. Have you known anyone who's ever seen anything? I persisted. No, but my father remembered as a young man seeing a pile of human bones being removed from the dungeon and buried in the churchyard. The late people lived to be very old and always kept Sir James's wing shut up. Now the place has changed hands, and probably the Youngs will never be disturbed. They are installed in the most modern part of the house and won't need to use the haunted wing. It must not be supposed that all haunted houses or rooms are unpleasant to live in. People in the flesh are either pleasant or unpleasant, disturbing or tranquil to live with, and so it is with their astral counterparts. When they elect to haunt the scenes of their old activities, some ghosts are so inoffensive that they can be lived with under the most tranquil conditions. One autumn we took a shooting lodge in the far north of Scotland, and though I recognized at once that it was frequented by an entity from the other side, I experienced no uneasy feelings whatever. We had not been in residence longer than 3 hours before this ghost put in an appearance. We were in a lively confusion of unpacking and settling down. Several large trunks had been carried upstairs and set down on a wide corridor onto which the bedrooms opened. I was on my knees unpacking one of those trunks. Our dog, Pompey, was seated beside me, superintending matters, and my maid was standing at my side, waiting to carry various articles into the different rooms. The hour was midday, and the early autumn sunshine flooded the house. Suddenly, Pompey growled and turned towards the staircase with all his hair bristling. I also looked round and saw a tall, quite ordinary man mounting the staircase. I thought nothing of this, supposing him to be the factor whom we expected, and I rose to my feet at once. He came on along the corridor straight towards us, and, looking directly at us, but when within about 10 feet from where we stood, he suddenly vanished. I heard my maid give a sharp exclamation, and at the same instant Pompey made a furious dash at the spot, and growling angrily began to pursue something invisible to us down the stairs. I followed as quickly as I could. I feared Pompey would be lost if he ran out into the deer forest surrounding us on all sides. I caught him at the deer fence edging the vegetable garden and induced him with some difficulty to return to the house. My maid and I compared notes. What I had seen accorded exactly with what she had seen. She soon got over her uncomfortable experience, and though I never saw this entity again, I often felt him near me. He was, however, of so colorless a personality that he never proved in the least disturbing to any one in the house. At the time of which I write, the astral plane was not so generally recognized as an actual residential quarter as it is now. In these days, a halfway house for the soul was not considered necessary for Protestants. They either went direct to heaven or hell according to their manner of life on earth. The Catholics alone had their purgatory, to which the departed souls repaired, there to slough off the passions of earth and fit themselves for higher realms. Purgatory and the astral plane mean the same thing now to the vast majority of thinkers. A halfway house for the soul, a condition of consciousness interpenetrating this earth, which may actually be visited under certain conditions by those still possessing a physical body, an abode so contiguous to this world as to make the words of the poet literally true. All houses wherein men have lived and died are haunted houses. In these days I used to get severely chaffed on the subject of the astral plane. Frivolous young things would say to me, "Hello, been on the astral plane lately?" One day I was undergoing a certain amount of good-natured chaff from a number of young people at Dunrobin Castle. I defended my beliefs vigorously, and at the last the present Lady Londonderry, then Miss Chaplin, the Duke's niece, challenged me to pick out the haunted room in the castle. I had never at that time been in any part of the building save in one bedroom and the public rooms. I at once took up the challenge, and the Duke remarked that I had my work cut out for me, as several of the rooms had a reputation for being haunted. I replied that I would undertake to pick out a room where life was still actively carried on by those who had suffered something terrible on that spot in the past, and who were now denizens of the astral plane. A small crowd of us then started, led by Miss Chaplin, and we went from room to room. She opened the door and remained with the others on the threshold. I walked into each room alone and gathered impressions. In several of the rooms I felt the presence of astral entities, but nothing of a strong or unpleasant nature. At last we came to a room occupied by a maid, sitting alone, sewing, and I felt instantly that my quest was at an end. There was a sharp atmosphere of anguish that was quite unmistakable. Some ghastly tragedy had taken place within those four walls, but I said nothing before the sewing woman. I felt drawn towards the window. The trouble was centered there. If I remember rightly, the room was high up and overlooking not the sea, but a paved courtyard. I walked back to the others with my finger on my lip, and Miss Chaplin closed the door behind me. "We need not go any further. That is the haunted room," I said, in a low voice that could not reach the woman inside. "You're right. You've found it," was the answer. "I heard the story when we went downstairs, but I can only recollect that it had to do with a Lady Sutherland who had been brutally flung out the window." I will now relate a curious incident of haunting by elementals, and it will be seen that such hauntings may quite easily appear to the ordinary observer as an abnormal occurrence to which no clue can be given. What is an elemental? It is only when the mystic has advanced in her studies that she discovers how manifold evolution is, and how small a part humanity really fills in the economy of nature. When a microscope is used, myriads of germs of life, unsuspected by us, are revealed. Even so, the invisible planes connected with this earth contain myriads of forms of life, of whose existence most of us are unconscious. When we read of a good or bad elemental, it must always be either an artificial entity or one of the many varieties of nature spirits that is meant. I will deal now with a case of the artificial variety. Such elementals are formed out of the elemental essence lying behind the mineral kingdom. It is the monadic essence or material used in creation, or it may be called the outpouring of divine force into matter. This elemental essence is marvelously sensitive to human thought. However fleeting, it responds instantly to the vibrations set up consciously or unconsciously by human will or desire. The influence of thought can mold a living force, good or evil, into an existence, evanescent or lasting. Such shapes possess a certain appropriateness to the character of the desire which calls them into existence, though they generally possess distortions, either unpleasant or terrifying. Persons who play with or use for some malign purpose black magic generally have a swarm of such semi-intelligent entities surrounding them, and professional black magicians can call artificial elementals of great power into existence and use them for their fell designs. As a rule, however, the enormous inchoate mass of entities known as elementals are beings of human thought creation, created in no malicious spirit, but more often the result of curiosity and tampering with a very dangerous power as yet little understood. The amateur magician, on passing over to the other side, by no means loses his taste for the grotesque and abnormal, and often continues to play pranks on those left behind by means of the dangerous powers he has acquired whilst on earth. I was visiting some old friends in the south of England. Some years before, they had succeeded to a fine inheritance, and it was the first time that I had stayed with them in that house. I did not experience any uncomfortable sensations in the bedroom appointed to me. It was early summertime, when there is but a short spell of darkness, and I was on such intimate terms with my hostess, herself a psychic, that I only had to say I disliked the atmosphere of my bedroom to have it changed. The former mistress of the house had been a very remarkable woman whom I had known intimately. She was brilliantly clever and accomplished and charming to talk to, but unfortunately she took a vivid interest in occultism of the wrong sort, in black magic, anything to do with spells, witchcraft, elementals, incantations, attracted her enormously, and she had a very considerable knowledge of the subject. I have no doubt she could have worked a great deal of mischief had she been so inclined, but luckily her designs were more impish than malign. I often warned her that there was undoubted danger in such researches, and that she was certain to attract about her elementals of a most undesirable kind. But my warnings went unheeded, and to the time of her death, her interest in the dark subject never flagged. She had not died in the house I had come to stay in, but it occurred to me as I dressed for dinner that I was in her old bedroom. This suggestion came to me suddenly, and to the accompaniment of a sound more felt than heard, a sound known to the spirit rather than to the ear, a tiptoe silence hovering on the brink of a sound's threshold. My surroundings gave a very pleasant impression. A glorious sunset was flooding the west. My room was full of golden light, and the window was flung wide to the warm summer air. There was nothing to be recorded, either ghostly or uncanny, yet something was present which made me uncomfortable. Strange thoughts, bizarre fancies found lodgment in my mind, and I stood rigid, listening intently. The room was full of secrets. They seemed suddenly to creep forth and whisper together. There it was again, that soft echo of a sound which was like no other sound. An eerie, uncanny sensation crept down my spine, a strange, indefinable feeling of uncertainty, not yet amounting to fear. I moved towards the corner of the room whence the sound proceeded, and as I approached, out of that corner dropped down a huge gray moth. A second dropped down after it, and both lay with outstretched wings on the white coverlet of the bed. Now, I have always had a peculiar antipathy to moths, the big furry sort. I can handle a spider and bear with a black beetle, but with big woolly moths I cannot live happily. I saw one once under a microscope, and it was covered with horrid-looking parasites. I am aware that other creatures are similarly afflicted, but this microscopic vision accentuated my horror of all big moths. They seem to me repulsive, sinister, and uncanny creatures. The curious thing is that though I dislike them, they adore me, and I always know that if there is one in my parish, it will find me out. On this occasion I felt a very natural desire to laugh at myself. Of course the creatures had at once discovered me, and this was all that had resulted from my uncomfortable sensations. A feeling of scorn swept over me. 2 moths had rustled softly. Could anything be more banal, more commonplace? I flung a towel over them and finished dressing. Then I rang for the housemaid. When she came, I told her she must accomplish the destruction of the occupants of my bed. I could see no moths flying about outside, but nevertheless the window must be kept closed till I opened it again in the dark before getting into bed. She told me that she was always particular to close the windows before bringing in a light, as the bats were a nuisance. I assured her I had no objection to a room full of bats, but I could not sleep in a room full of moths. She promised to look about the room whilst it was still light, and destroy any she found. I closed the window myself, and went down to dinner. We were but 3 women present, my hostess, myself, and a friend of ours, and we spent a delightful evening together talking of old times. That night, before beginning to undress, I blew out my candle, and throwing up the window, I stood looking forth upon enchantment. It was still light, with a lustre that filled all space, and it seemed wicked to shut out such beauty. Westward the stars were pale, but southward one great dull red star shone low on the horizon. The owls were haunting the gardens with their banshee notes. It was a night for the revelation of the fairy folk, elves and pixies, fauns and dryads, elfins, nymphs and satyrs. A night when she tells her secrets to her lovers in the psalmody of nature, when the spirits of earth, fire, air, and water utter softly to human souls, if they will but incline the ear to hearken to the message. If I want a definition of God, I shall go, not to the bell and the book, but to a starlit, fragrant garden, where I can look long and deep into the passion of creation's eyes. I will be as the old grey poet who wrote, I am he that walks with the tender and growing night. I call the earth and sea, half hid by the night. Press close, magnetic, nourishing night. Night of the south wind, night of the large few stars. Across the hushed magic came silver sweet the strokes of 11 from the village church, and the spell was broken. I closed the window, lit my candles, and prepared for bed. Just before extinguishing my lights and reopening the window, I carried a candle to the side of the bed with a box of matches. What was my horror on discovering that the turned-down bed and both pillows were liberally strewn with enormous gray moths. The sight was extraordinary. I literally could not believe my eyes. I stood there staring and mechanically counting them, 20, 30. I turned back to the dressing table with the candle still in my hand. What was I to do? If I had the courage to destroy them, what sort of condition would the bed be in after? I am writing of actual facts and without the least exaggeration. The smallest of those moths must have been quite an inch long in their fat gray bodies and quite 3 inches long across the wings. I thought I knew most moths by sight and name, but I had never seen any like these before. What depressed me most was the fact that moths are attracted by candlelight. I had been burning 4 candles for quite 20 minutes, and not a moth had forsaken the bed for the flame. I was positively certain that they had not flown in whilst I stood in the dark of the open window. They were far too big and numerous to have escaped observation. What was I to do? I could not use that bed, and now I felt a strong repulsion for the room. I regretted deeply that the household must all be in bed, because I knew that no description I could give would convey anything like actuality, and the truth was certain to appear wild exaggeration. I made up my mind at once. I knew there were several unoccupied rooms on either side of me, and taking my lighted candle, I placed it, still lit, in a basin on the marble-topped washstand. It should remain lit all night, and in the morning I would come to search for victims. The other candles I extinguished, all but one to take with me, and leaving the window still shut, I softly left the room. I entered the next bedroom and approached the bed. Of course, there were no sheets, but the white dust sheet covering the blankets was spotless. There was not a moth to be seen anywhere. Blowing out my candle, I opened the window, and getting into bed between the blankets, I was soon fast asleep. I awakened to glorious sunshine and looked at my wristwatch, which I had placed beside my bed. 6 o'clock and a lovely warm summer morning. I jumped out of bed, full of curiosity regarding my visitors of overnight, and returned to my own room. Not a trace of a moth was to be seen anywhere. The candle had burnt itself out. No singed wings or blackened bodies lay near. The window was shut. I threw it wide and then went round the room, shaking curtains, looking behind pictures, and climbing on a chair, I examined the top of the wardrobe. Not the faintest signs of the great gray drove of the night before. Where could they have all vanished to? I gave it up and got into my own bed to await the advent of my early tea. I hated having to tell the housemaid that I had been driven into another room, but I knew she would find out the fact for herself. She was obviously incredulous and assured me she had thoroughly searched the room and seen but 2 winged creatures, those she had removed from the bed. I had seen for myself, when coming to bed, that the window had remained shut. She had often seen 1 or 2 brown moths in the rooms at night, but she owned that never before had she seen huge gray ones. The matter was left at that, and during the day I told my hostess of my adventure, and she at once ordered the room I had slept in to be prepared for me, in case I might encounter the same difficulties again. I dressed for dinner in the moth room without catching a sight of one. When bedtime came, we 3 women all entered the room together. On approaching the bed and looking down on it, no one spoke for a moment. Then my fellow guest exclaimed, "Well, I must say that if I had not seen this with my own eyes, I never would have believed it." The bed was liberally sprinkled with large gray moths. My hostess shivered. "Come away and let us shut the door. It's too horrible," she said. During the remainder of my visit, I was perfectly comfortable in my new room, and the curious fact must be stated that after I had left the moth room, the moths forsook it too. I could discern a pitying incredulity in the housemaid's attitude towards me afterwards. She had seen but two, and she did not believe in the drove. My hostess and friend, who had witnessed the phenomenon, at once agreed that there was something more in it than an entomological curiosity. I would have given much for the opinion of a naturalist. What, I wonder, would he have made of that fat gray flock sprinkling the bed? What species of moth would he have declared them to be? I have searched in many books since, and never found anything the least resembling them, and I retain my original firm belief that they were nothing more or less than a flock of elementals, sent forth as a practical joke by a practiced magician on the other side. End of Chapter 18, Haunted Rooms. Read by Andrea Dace, Norfolk, Virginia, July 2023.
Chapter 19 of Ghosts I Have Seen and Other Psychic Experiences by Violet Tweedale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Piotr. Chapter 19. The New Jeanne D'Arc. Before writing on the above subject, which is proving today of absorbing interest to a very large number of people, Protestant as well as Catholic, I will point out a curious fact that is occultly connected with it. At certain periods in our normal life, certain subjects, lying quite outside our earthly experience, begin quite suddenly to be talked of and written upon. No one knows why. No one outside occultism can even form a conjecture why such subjects should suddenly obsess the brains of a considerable number of persons, why they should crop up in the most unexpected places, or why they should form the foundations of a considerable mass of literature. It would appear as if they were floating in the air at some particular time, and masses of people catch them up like germs, and carry them about until their power is exhausted. I will give an instance. In the years just before the war, the great god Pan drifted across our mental horizon and was at once drawn into our aura. No one knows anything about the great god Pan. He is supposed to belong to mythology, but novelists of distinction at once began to write upon him, not one after the other, but simultaneously. I read at least 3 thrilling novels in which he figured largely, and I myself was impelled to write a novel upon the same subject. I began the book knowing nothing of the god beyond what I could gather from the London Library and Fraser's Golden Bough. But as I proceeded, I was conscious of new information drifting in from without, and on finishing the book, I found that other authors had been at work on the same subject. The great god Pan appeared on the stage, and a popular actress sang a song about him. One heard his name mentioned constantly in society, and hideous stories were told of him in Bohemian art circles. He was the bugbear of the seance room. Journalists mentioned him in quite serious articles, and I once heard his name spoken from a pulpit. The bare fact of this seemingly inconsequent disease, for it almost amounted to a disease with us, drifting into our stolid British atmosphere, was not curious to the occultist, who is aware that at certain times certain subjects are flooded in on us from the other side by those who have our welfare at heart. I never heard any explanation of why Pan should have come here to play quite an important part in our mental lives, or why he should have obsessed so many of us for about a couple of years. The more one discovered about him, the less one liked him, but psychics are led to believe that there are many schemes of evolution hovering about us, and interpenetrating our own, though not visible to our normal consciousness. It may therefore be that the great god Pan did actually come into our atmosphere, and thus his individuality impressed itself upon those whose minds were plastic to such impressions. Possibly he arrived on this earth much as the aerolite arrives, drawn out of his own orbit by the superior attraction of this globe. The great god Pan was what might be termed the forerunner of the devil's reincarnation. The belief in a personal devil was rapidly dying out amongst us, in spite of the sorrows of Satan, and the belief in the prince of this world, so insisted upon throughout the Old and New Testaments. There is no more engrossing subject for the occultist to indulge in than gathering together every verse in the Bible dealing with the evil one, and trying, with the aid of ancient traditions, to piece a coherent story together. When one gets a certain distance in the study, one comes to the conclusion that there is a great deal more in it than meets the eye. It is a vast subject, and I think the most profoundly occult mystery extant and undeciphered. The devil now occupies a prominent position in the collective thought of the nation. An enormous number of people believe now in his existence, who would have scorned the bare idea before 1916. It was in that year that he began to loom large in the beliefs of quite materially minded people, and his advent into actual, active existence at once complicated matters terribly. Said a well-known writer to me, "I think there is something in it. It's very tiresome. I was just beginning to settle down in my beliefs. Now I am all upset again by this concept of a personal adversary to the supreme ruler." In the early weeks of 1917, a new impression drifted in on us. Some angel came down and stirred the pool of the world and left us with the Sacred Heart. The Sacred Heart was the forerunner of the new Jeanne D'Arc, Claire Ferchot. There is nothing that has more astonished the Catholic world than hearing the Sacred Heart talked of by Protestants, and actually adopted by them as a sacred symbol. Hitherto it has been exclusively a part of Catholic worship. There was such a demand for the little metal Sacred Heart images, a figure of the Christ with hands outstretched and a flaming heart at his breast, that can be carried about in the pocket, that they were not to be bought in England, and were hard to procure abroad. Enormous numbers had been sent to the front by persons belonging to all denominations, who treasured one of their own at home. Very suddenly the Sacred Heart became an object of veneration amongst thousands to whom Roman Catholicism was anathema. Then came the demand from France that the Sacred Heart should be placed above the tricolour. I had not heard of Claire Ferchot before the beginning of 1918, though her divine mission began about 6 years previously. Occultists began to speak of her amongst themselves as one who would yet save France. This hope was never lost sight of in the country's darkest hours. Now there is a steadily growing demand amongst the educated British public to learn all that can be known about this girl who has been called the new Joan of Arc. In 1916 she was summoned to appear before an ecclesiastical commission at Poitiers, in the same room in which the Maid of Orleans was interrogated, before being placed at the head of the army of deliverance. Both Claire Ferchot and her communications were subjected to the strictest scrutiny. The result was entirely in her favour. Her writings were examined by Father Vadrieux, D.D., M.S.D., who declared them inspired, and equal to those of Saint Catherine of Siena and Saint Teresa. Finally they were taken to Rome and submitted to a commission appointed by the Holy See, the result being that she was ordered to continue her mission. The writings deal with devotion to the Sacred Heart and the dignity of priesthood. One is irresistibly reminded of the opening scenes at Lourdes, whilst Bernadette Soubirous was alive, in 1858. Again, one cannot but recall a certain similarity betwixt certain events in the life of the Maid of Orleans and the events taking place now in the life of Claire Ferchot. Claire is a girl 22 years old, the daughter of a peasant proprietor in the village of Ranfilière, a mile from Lublin, XVIII Department, France. Her parents are alive, and she has 2 sisters and 3 brothers. The father and 1 brother fought during the war, another brother was a prisoner, and the youngest assists on the farm. One of the sisters works on the farm, and the eldest sister is a religieuse in the community of La Sagesse. Claire was tending her family's flocks when the first great revelation came to her 9 years ago. Then she was but 13 years old. She had crept into a thicket to read, and suddenly the Divine Master appeared to her and bade her lay down her book. He told her she had been chosen for a divine mission, and that he would guide and instruct her. He showed her the Sacred Heart covered with wounds. On recounting her vision to her priest, she was treated with coldness and disbelief, and on her telling him 2 years later that our Lord daily appeared to her in Holy Communion, she was treated still more coldly. Until he himself received a sign, he maintained an attitude of utter disbelief. What happened soon after, whilst he was celebrating Holy Mass, entirely convinced him. At that particular part of the canon, when the priest divides the sacred species, he saw blood issue from the sacred host. Nor was this all. A week afterwards he observed Claire Ferchot in a trance in his own church, and he saw her using a handkerchief as if wiping some object in front of her, which he could not see. Bloodstains appeared on the handkerchief, and increased as she repeated the action. Filled with amazement, he sought later for an explanation, and she told him, "Our Lord appeared before me, suffering greatly because of the terrible sins of the world, and he asked me to do for him what Veronica did on the road to Calvary, to wipe away the bloody sweat that trickled down his face. I saw the Sacred Heart riddled with wounds, and the deepest wound of all was inflicted by France, the eldest daughter of the Church, on whom he had lavished so deep a love. Once before he appeared to me walking upon ears of corn, which he crushed to powder." The priest, after hearing this explanation, took the handkerchief to the bishop, who listened to the wonderful story with sympathetic attention. He examined the blood-stained handkerchief minutely, and sent for a nun. "If," he said, "the stains are what they are represented to be, they cannot be washed out." The bishop put the matter to the test, and watched the nun endeavouring to remove the stains. It was all in vain, and the bishop, standing by his own test, declared the mission of Claire Ferchot to be divine. Every night, between 11 and 12 o'clock, Claire beholds apparitions, and receives the sacred teaching that was promised, and it was in 1916 that she was ordered to Poitiers to undergo cross-examination. Unfortunately, the further development of Claire Ferchot's mission cannot yet be communicated to the world, but in time it will be, and very startling and wonderful it will seem. Meanwhile she encountered very strong opposition. With considerable difficulty, the deputy of Vendée arranged a meeting between Claire and Monsieur Poincaré. Claire implored him to permit the emblem of the Sacred Heart to be placed on the standards of France, as the one condition of success. Unfortunately, Monsieur Poincaré had to refuse, owing to political reasons, though as proof of her mission she disclosed an incident only known to him, which happened after the victory of the Marne. The same adverse influence operated at her interview with Monsieur Clemenceau. This appointment was arranged by the Archbishop of Rennes, Cardinal Dusson. The Archbishop implored Monsieur Clemenceau to fix a date of public intercession for France. This also the Prime Minister of France had reluctantly to refuse. It is openly stated that before the later French successes, the emblem of the Sacred Heart was secretly sewn upon the flags of France, and it is also affirmed that General Foch is a devoted lover of the Sacred Heart, and bears its emblem with him wherever he goes. Great changes have come about in the village where Claire Ferchot dwells. Formerly a sleepy, neglected little place, it is now converted into a scene of the greatest activity. From all parts of France the pilgrims come. some on foot, having walked many miles, some in motors and horse-driven vehicles. Hundreds of soldiers find their way there, and it is estimated that from 15 to 20,000 people pass through Loughry in a month. With the consent of her bishop, Claire Fershot has formed a small community of 9, and is now established in a temporary convent adjacent to her parish church at Loughry. It is believed that her divine mission will be accomplished in 1922, and that she will then be released from earthly life. Claire has predicted a stormy period for France after peace has been signed. According to her prophecy, there will be violent unrest until rulers arise who possess firm religious convictions. At the beginning of the war, she affirmed that the French army would never prosper until the troops were commanded by a true son of the Church. This affirmation she claimed to receive from a divine source. When Marshal Foch took over the supreme command, she was satisfied that victory, so far as the French arms were concerned, was assured. As all the world knows, and as all may learn who read Hindman's life of his old friend Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France, like the majority of his colleagues, is frankly atheistical. Claire Fershot claims to have received the divine intimation that until this condition of mind is superseded by a public acknowledgment of a supreme divine power, a supreme arbiter over the destinies of the world, the affairs of France can never prosper. She predicts that in 1922 rulers will arise who will bow before a power superior to their own human energies. The first part of her prophecy has come true. A man of God won his way to the front and saved France and the Allies at the darkest hour of their tribulation. The supreme command was vested in a man of profound religious convictions who carried his beliefs and observances openly into the arena of war. I translate the words written lately to me by one who has served under Ferdinand Foch. They throw a brilliant light upon a great soul. I can see him now, alone and unattended, at an hour when the church of Castel was deserted, praying and seeking comfort in the great sorrow of which he never spoke. He has lost his only son, and one of his daughters was widowed. In spite of his indomitable energy, there was about him an air of profound melancholy and sadness. At certain moments his eyes seemed to say, "I approach the twilight of my life in the consciousness of being a good servant who will repose in the peace of God. My faith in life eternal, in a good God, has sustained me in my hardest hours. Prayer has illumined my soul. See to it, you young men of France, who are without a great ideal, without any concept of the spiritual side of the life. There can be nothing for you but discouragement and feebleness. We demand of you great sacrifices to the end. Accept those sacrifices as I accept mine, who believe that spirit must prevail over matter." End of chapter 19. The new Jeanne d'Arc.
Chapter 20 of Ghosts I Have Seen and Other Psychic Experiences by Violet Tweedale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 20 Haunted Houses, Castel a Mare. I have never yet met anyone who was not interested in haunted houses. Even the most blatant skeptic always wants to hear all about it, though he has predetermined to treat the story with his habitual scoffing incredulity. Of all the departments of psychical research, none commands more general interest than a spooky house. And there are few people who cannot name a dwelling which has acquired the reputation for being haunted by denizens of the other world. Of course, any house that falls into serious disrepair and remains unoccupied for some long period, any dwelling whose owner permits decay to proceed unchecked and dilapidation to run its course, at once suggests the thought to the beholder, What a haunted-looking old place. And rumor, in such cases, quickly supplies all the old phenomena, even though tradition be totally absent. Tramps are always on the lookout for such shelters, and their damped-down fires catch the eye of some scared rustic who happens to be passing in the dark. Rats and the winds of heaven play hide-and-seek through the deserted rooms and corridors, and owls find sanctuary in the surrounding gardens. Their cries, varying from the exultant shriek to the mournful wail, add a weird suggestiveness to the abiding melancholy of such abandoned habitations. There is so much talk nowadays of hauntings and ghosts that it seems strange we should know so very little about them. I have never heard a really convincing explanation of why ghosts should haunt certain houses, and I have no explanation of my own to offer. If ghosts could be commanded, if one could be sure of witnessing certain phenomena that have been elaborately described to one, then there might be the ghost of a chance of advantageous investigation. No such opportunities seem to be afforded the investigator. He may watch for months and see nothing, yet the elusive wraith may turn up before several witnesses on the very night after he has abandoned his quest out of sheer boredom and discouragement. Some 7 years ago, whilst wintering in Torquay, I heard a great deal of gossip about a villa on the Warberries, which was reputed to be badly haunted. For the last 40 to 50 years, nobody, it was said, had been able to live in it for any length of time. Several people asserted that they had heard screams coming from it as they passed along the high road, and no occupant had ever been able to keep a door shut or even locked. The house is at present being pulled down, therefore, I commit no indiscretion in describing the phenomena connected with it. Castel Mare is situated in what house agents would describe as a highly residential quarter. It is surrounded by numerous villas, inhabited by people who are all very well-to-do and who make Torquay their permanent home. The majority of these villas lie right back from the road and are hidden in their own luxuriant gardens. But the haunted house is one of several whose back premises open straight onto the road. No dwelling could have looked more commonplace or uninteresting. It was built in the form of a high box, 3-storied. It was hideous and inartistic in the extreme, but along its frontage, looking towards the sea and hidden from the road, there ran a wide balcony onto which the second-floor rooms opened, and from there, the view over the garden was charming. When I first went to look at it, dilapidation had set in. Jackdaws and starlings were busy in the chimneys, the paint was peeling off the walls, and most of the windows were broken. Year after year, those windows were mended, but they never remained intact for more than a week, and during the war, there has been no attempt at renewal. Even the agents' boards, to be let or sold, dropped one by one from their stems, as if in sheer weariness of so fruitless an announcement. It was not long before I obtained the loan of the keys, and proceeded to take the atmosphere. It was decidedly unhealthful, I concluded, though I neither heard nor saw anything unusual during the hour I spent alone in quietly wandering through the deserted rooms. I found no trace of tramps, and all the closed windows were thickly cobwebbed inside, an important fact to notice in psychic research. I fixed upon the bathroom and one other small room as the foci of the trouble, and left the house with no other strong impression than that my movements had been closely watched by someone unseen by me. It was no uncommon sight in pre-war days to see several smart motor cars drawn up at the gate. Frivolous parties of explorers in search of a thrill drove in from the surrounding neighborhood and romped gaily through the house and out again. And I discovered that several of those visitors had distinctly felt that they were being followed about and watched. My husband and I were naturally much interested in this haunted dwelling, so accessible and so near to our own house. We determined that if we could make friends with the owner, we would do a little investigation on our own. Numerous people, on the plea that the house might suit them as a residence, got the loan of the keys, and spent an hour or two inside the place, wandering about the house and garden. But the owner was getting tired of this rush of spurious house hunters. He was beginning to ask for bona fides, so we determined honestly to state our purpose. The proprietor was an old builder who owned several other houses. He received me very civilly, even gratefully. He would willingly give us the keys for as long a period as we required them. Castel and Mare brought him extreme bad luck. He longed to be rid of it, and he added that after our investigations, if my husband could give the house a clean bill of health, it would be of enormous benefit to him in enabling him to let or sell it. He did not seem very hopeful, but stated it to be his opinion that the hauntings were all nonsense, and that the screams people heard were the cries of some peacocks that lived in a property not far off. This sounded very reasonable, and I promised him that if we could honestly state that the house was perfectly unhealthful, we would permit our conclusions to be made public. My husband and I decided that the hour 1 p.m. till 2 p.m. would be the quietest and least conspicuous time in which to investigate. Doubtless the night would have been better still, but it would have created too much excitement in the neighborhood, and callers to see how we were bearing up would have defeated our object. Between 1 and 2, all Torquay would be lunching, and we could easily slip in unobserved. And we would require neither lights nor warm comforts. We started at once, my husband keeping the keys and making himself responsible for the doors. Though the window panes were badly broken, there were no openings large enough to admit a small child. And, as I have said, the network of cobwebs within was evidence that no human being entered the house by the windows. The front door lock was in good order, and so were most of the other locks in the house. We shut ourselves in, and after a thorough examination of the premises, we mounted to the first floor. 3 rooms opened onto it, belonging to the principal bedroom, a smaller room, and a bathroom opening out of the big bedroom. My husband closed all the doors, and we sat down on the lower steps of the bare staircase leading to the floor above. That day we drew an absolute blank, and at 2 o'clock we closed every door in the house. And just inside the front door, we made a careless-looking arrangement of twigs, dead leaves, pieces of straw and dust, which could not fail to betray the passing of human feet should anybody possess a duplicate key to the front door and enter by that means. The second day, we found our twig and straw arrangements intact, but not a single door was shut. All were thrown defiantly wide. This seemed rather promising, and we went upstairs to our seat on the steps, and carefully reclosing the doors immediately in front of us, sat down to await events. Quite half an hour must have passed when suddenly a click made us both look up. The handle of the door, but a couple of yards distant from me, leading into the small room, was turning, and the door quietly opened wide enough to admit the passing of a human being. It was a bright sunny day, and one could see the brass knob turning round quite distinctly. We saw no form of any sort, and the door remained half open. For perhaps a couple of moments we awaited developments. Then our attention was suddenly switched off the door by the sound of hurrying footsteps running along the bare boards on the corridor above us. My husband rushed up and searched each empty room, but neither saw anything nor heard anything more. Before leaving the house, we shut all doors and locked all that would lock. Such was the meager extent of our second day's investigations. On the third day, the doors were all found wide flung. No door opened before our eyes as on our former visit, but a brushing sound was heard ascending the stairs, as if from someone pressing close against the wall. For about a fortnight, nothing happened beyond what I have recounted, but I was strongly conscious that we were being watched. The most unhealthful spots were the bathroom, a servant's room entered by a staircase leading from the kitchen, and the stable, a small building immediately to the right of the house. The bathroom was in great disrepair. Long strips of paper hung from the walls, and an air of profound depression pervaded it. Obviously, it had once been merely a large cupboard, and it had a window admitting light from a passage behind it. We had never once failed to find every door which we had closed thrown wide on our return, and one day we locked the bathroom, and removing the key, we looked about for some spot in which to secrete it. On that floor was nothing large enough to hide even so small an object as a key, so we took it downstairs to the dining room. In a corner lay a rag of linoleum about 6 inches square. Under this we placed the bathroom key and left the house. That afternoon, a house agent called and asked for the loan of the keys. He told us that a brave widow who knew the history of the house thought it might suit her to live in, and he proposed to take her over it and point out its charms. He would return the keys to us directly afterwards. I took advantage of this occasion to say to the agent that probably the screams some people had heard proceeded from the peacocks in the neighborhood. He shook his head and answered, "We hoped that might prove to be the case, but we have ascertained that it is not so." He seemed despondent about the place, even though what we had to tell him was as yet nothing very formidable or exciting. What we did not tell him was that we had locked up the bathroom and hidden the key. We left him to discover that fact for himself. He returned with the keys in about an hour, and I asked him what the widow thought of Castel a Mare. "She thinks something might be made of it. The cheapness attracts her," he answered. "But it will need so much doing to it," I demurred. "What did she think of the bathroom?" "She said it only needed cleaning and repapering. The bath itself she found in good enough condition. So the bathroom door was open, in spite of our having locked it and hidden the key." After the agent had gone, we went to the house. Every door stood wide. The bathroom key was still in its hiding place, and the door open. We replaced the key. The ghosts laughed to scorn such securities as locks and keys. For a month or two, we pursued our investigations. Then we returned the keys to the owner. Though we had seen and heard so little, it was impossible to give the house a clean bill of health, and the old builder was much cast down. A few days afterwards, we received a letter from him offering us the house as a free gift. It would pay him to be rid of the ground rent, and the place was as useless to him as to anyone else. We thanked him and refused the gift. About this period, I was lucky enough to get into touch with a former tenant of Castel a Mare, and this lady most kindly gave me many details of her residence there. About 30 years ago, she occupied it with her father and mother, and they were the last family to live in it for any length of time, and for many years it has remained empty. Soon after their arrival, this family discovered that there was something very much amiss with their new residence. The house, the garden, and the stable were decidedly uncanny. But it was some time before they would admit, even to themselves, that the strange happenings were of a supernatural order. The phenomena fell under 3 headings: a piercing scream heard continually, at any hour and during all seasons, continuous steps running along corridors and up and down stairs, constant lockings of doors by unseen hands. The scream was decidedly the most unnerving of the various phenomena. The family lived in constant dread of it. Sometimes it came from the garden, sometimes from inside the house. One morning, whilst they sat at breakfast, they were violently startled by this horrible sound coming from the inner hall, just outside the room in which they sat. It took but a moment to throw open the door, but, as usual, there was nothing to be seen. On another occasion, the family doctor had just arrived at the front door, and was about to ring, when he was startled by the scream coming from inside the house. This doctor still lives in the neighborhood, and is one of many people who can bear witness to the fact. The footsteps of unseen people kept the family pretty busy. They were always running to the doors to see who was hurrying past and up and down stairs. Very soon, the drawing room became extremely uncomfortable and practically uninhabitable. It was always full of unseen people moving about. The lady of the house never felt herself alone, and when she found herself locked into her own room, the behavior of her astral guests seemed to her to have become intolerable. The master of the house no more escaped these attentions than did the rest of the inhabitants. And finally, all keys had to be removed from all doors. One night, some guests, after getting into bed, heard someone open the door of their room and enter. Astonishment kept them silent, and in a minute or two, their visitor quietly withdrew and closed the door again. They concluded that it must have been their hostess, and that thinking they were asleep, she had not spoken. Yet still, they thought the incident very strange. The next morning they discovered that no member of the household had entered their room. On another occasion, a lady who had come to help nurse a sick sister saw one night a strange woman dressed in black velvet walk downstairs. Animals fared badly at Castel Mare. A large dog belonging to the family was often found cowering and growling in abject fear of something visible to it, but not to the human inhabitants. And the harness horse showed such an invincible objection to its stable that it could only be got in by backing. Later on, I was told that a member of the Psychical Society had visited Castel Mare and had pronounced the garden to be more haunted than the house. It is interesting to note how absolutely untenable badly haunted houses become. No matter how skeptical, how resolutely material the tenants may be, the phenomena wear them down to a humble surrender at last. After all, what can people do but quit a residence which is constantly showing incontrovertible evidence that it is possessed by numerous unseen entities that defy analysis? Everyone is interested in getting rid of this weird disturbance, but how to do it? The skeptic is resolute in unmasking the fraud, but finds himself balked by intangibility. He hears the scream at his door and rushes to arrest the miscreant, but sees no one to grapple with. Domestic difficulties become acute. No warning is given, no wages asked. The servants decamp, too scared to care for anything but putting distance between themselves and the nameless dread. Visitors begin to fight shy of the house. They have heard the screams. Month after month, the master of the house, thinking of his rent and his reputation for sanity, and what the loss of both would mean to him, clings to skepticism as his only hope and refuge. He is not going to be driven forth by any such stuff and nonsense as ghosts. Why? There are no such things. Seen things? Heard things? Well, yes, he has, but of course there must be some rational explanation. A man who has fought for king and country is not going to be defeated and put to flight by a pack of silly women's stories. He will soon get to the bottom of the whole affair, then woe betide the practical joker. When alone, he racks his brains in vain. He is furious with himself for having heard the scream, and tells himself he must be going dotty. He is puzzled, baffled, irritated, but more determined than ever to stick it out. Who can the joker be who is demoralizing his household, who has even dared to lock him into his own room? He thinks of his wife and family, and of their shattered nerves. He thinks of his terrified servants, and of his dog, which can no longer be persuaded to enter the house. He feels he must look elsewhere for the disturber of his peace. But where? He keeps careful watch unknown, as he thinks, to his family. The steps approach him, pass close to him, then die away in the distance, leaving him fuming, impotent. He finds it necessary to wipe his brow, which enrages him still more. At dead of night, he watches on the staircase, with all lights full on. Silence. Utter silence. Absolutely nothing to be seen or heard. He thinks of going to bed. He always said the whole thing was Tommy rot. The deathly silence is suddenly rent by a piercing scream at his very elbow, and he leaps to his feet, growling out an oath below his breath. He looks wildly round on every side of him. Nothing! Something strange is happening to his head. He passes his hand over his hair. It seems to be creeping along his scalp, and he thinks of the quills of a porcupine. What the devil is he to do? Go to bed, answers inclination. You're doing no good here. Yes, go to bed. That's the sensible thing to do. The next morning, everyone asks him if he heard it. He acknowledges to himself that his temper is becoming vile. The day comes when he is left alone with his family. The staff has fled, and he feels rather broken. At last, he gives in, and agrees to seek another home. But it is not to the ghosts he gives in, but to the nervous fancies of a pack of silly women. He feels wonderfully lighthearted, however, now that his mind is made up, and a glow of magnanimity pervades him. If you do a thing at all, do it well and at once, he tells himself, and promptly hires another house in another neighborhood. When questioned by his men friends, he laughs. The man in the street might understand certain things that he could tell, but the man in the club, never. All Tommy rot, my dear chap, but my wife got nervous, and the servants. You know what they are, scared by the scratch of a mouse. For the women's sake, I thought it best to quit. You know what women are when they once get an idea into their heads. End of chapter 20. Castel a Mare. Read by Marissa D6. Largo, Florida, August 19th, 2023. Chapter 21 of Ghosts I Have Seen and Other Psychic Experiences by Violet Tweedale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 21. The Sequel. In 1917, a friend rang me up and asked me if I would form one of a party of investigation at Castel a Mare. The services of a medium had been secured, and a soldier on leave, who was deeply immersed in psychic research, was in high hopes of getting some genuine results. I accepted the invitation because a certain incident had once more roused my curiosity in the haunted house. During our investigations, I had been disappointed at not hearing the much-talked-of scream, the more so after learning from the former tenants how very often they had heard it. When I did at last hear it, I was walking past the house on a very hot summer morning, about 11 o'clock. I was not thinking of the house, and had just passed it on my way home, when a piercing scream arrested my attention. I wheeled round instantly. There was not a doubt as to where the scream came from, but unfortunately, though there were people on the road, there was no one near enough to bear witness. The scream appeared to come from someone in abject terror, and would have arrested the attention of anyone who happened to be passing. I mean that had no haunted house stood there, had the scream proceeded from any other villa, I am sure that any passerby would have halted wonderingly, and awaited further developments. Castel a Mare lay in absolute silence, under the blazing sunshine, and in a minute or two I walked on. I could now understand what it must have meant to live in that house, in constant dread of that weird and hideous sound resounding through the rooms or garden. This incident made me eager to join my friend's party, and on reaching the house I found a small crowd assembled. The medium, myself, and 4 other women, the soldier, and an elderly and burly builder belonging to the neighborhood who was interested in psychic research. 8 persons in all. As there was no chair or furniture of any description in the house, we carried in a small empty box from a rubbish heap outside, and followed the medium through the rooms. She elected to remain in the large bedroom on the first floor, out of which opened the bathroom, and she sat down on the box and leaned her back against the wall, whilst we lounged about the room and awaited events. It was a sunny summer afternoon, and the many broken panes of glass throughout the house admitted plenty of air. After some minutes, it was plain to see that the medium had fallen into a trance. Her eyes were closed, and she lay back as if in sound sleep. Time passed. Nothing happened. We were all rather silent, as I had warned the party that though we were in a room at the side of the house farthest from the road, our voices could plainly be heard by passers-by, and we wanted no interference. Just as we were all beginning to feel rather bored and tired of standing, the medium sprang to her feet with surprising agility, pouring out a volume of violent language. Her voice had taken on the deep growling tones of an infuriated man who advanced menacingly towards those of us who were nearest to him. In harsh, threatening voice, he demanded to know what right we had to intrude on his privacy. There was a general scattering of the scared party before this unlooked-for attack, and the soldier gave it as his opinion that the medium was now controlled by the spirit of a very violent male entity. I had no doubt upon the point. Then commenced so very unpleasant a scene that I had no doubt also of the medium's genuineness. No charlatan, dependent upon fraudulent mediumship for her daily bread, would have made herself so intensely obnoxious as did this frail little woman. I found myself saying, never again. This isn't good enough. The entity that controlled her possessed superhuman strength. His voice was like the bellow of a bull, as he told us to be gone, or he would throw us out himself, and his language was shocking. I had warned the medium on entering the house that we must be as quiet as possible, or we would have the police walking in on us. Now, I expected any moment to see a policeman, or some male stranger, arrive on the scene and demand to know what was the matter. The majority of our party were keeping at a safe distance, but suddenly the control rushed full tilt at the soldier, who had stood his ground, and attacking him with a tigerish fury, drew blood at once. The big builder and I rushed forward to his aid. The rest of the party forsook us and fled, pell-mell, out of the house and into the garden. Glancing through a window, near which we fought, I saw below a row of scared faces staring up in awed wonder. The scene being enacted was really amazing. This frail little creature threw us off like feathers and drove us foot by foot before her, always heading us off the bathroom. We tried to stand our ground and dodge her furious lunges, but she was too much for us. After a desperate scuffle, which lasted quite 7 or 8 minutes and resulted in much torn clothing, she drove us out of the room and onto the landing. Then suddenly, without warning, the entity seemed to evacuate the body he had controlled, and the medium went down with a crash and lay at our feet, just a little crumpled, disheveled heap. For some considerable time, I thought that she was dead. Her lips were blue, and I could feel no pulse. We had neither water nor brandy with which to revive her, and we decided to carry her down into the garden and see what fresh air would do. Though villas stood all round us, the foliage of the trees gave us absolute privacy, and we laid her flat on the lawn. There, after about 10 minutes, she gradually regained her consciousness, and seemingly none the worse for her experiences, she sat up and asked what had happened. We did not give her the truth in its entirety, and contrived to account for the blood-stained soldier and the torn clothing, without unduly shocking and distressing her. We then dispersed, the medium walking off as if nothing whatever had occurred to deplete her strength. Some days after this, the soldier begged for another experiment with the medium. He had no doubts as to her genuineness, and he was sure that if we tried again, we would get further developments. She was willing to try again, and so was the builder. But with one exception, the rest of the party refused to have anything more to do with the unpleasant affair, and the one exception stipulated to remain in the garden. She very wisely remarked that if she came into the house, there was no knowing what entity might not attach itself to her and return home with her, and she was not going to risk it. Of course, this real danger always had to be counted upon in such investigations, but as the men of the party desired a woman to accompany the medium, I consented, and we entered the house once more, a reduced party of 4. After the medium had remained entranced for some minutes, the same male entity again controlled her. The same violence, the same attacks began once more, but this time we were better prepared to defend ourselves. The soldier and the stalwart builder warded off the attacks and tried conciliatory expostulations, but all to no purpose. Then the soldier, who seemed to have considerable experience in such matters, tried a system of exorcising, sternly bidding the malignant entity depart. There ensued a very curious spiritual conflict between the exorcist and the entity, in which sometimes it seemed as if one, then the other, was about to triumph. Those wavering moments were useful in giving us breathing space from the assaults, and at length having failed, as we desired, to get into the bathroom, we drove him back against the wall at the far end of the room. Finally, the exorcist triumphed, and the medium collapsed on the floor as the strength of the control left her. For a few moments, we allowed the crumpled-up little heap to remain where she lay, whilst we mopped our brows and regained our breath. The soldier had brought a flask of brandy, which we proposed to administer to the unconscious medium. But quite suddenly, a new development began. She raised her head, and still crouching on the floor with closed eyes, she began to cry bitterly. Wailing and moaning and uttering inarticulate words, she had become the picture of absolute woe. "Another entity has got hold of her," announced the soldier. It certainly appeared to be so. All signs of violence had gone. The medium had become a heartbroken woman. We raised her to her feet. Her condition was pitiable, but her words became more coherent. "Poor master! On the bed! Help him! Help him!" she moaned, and pointed to one side of the room. Again and again she indicated, by clenching her hands on her throat, that death by strangulation was the culmination of some terrible tragedy that had been enacted in that room. She wandered in a desolate manner about the floor, wringing her hands, the tears pouring down her cheeks, whilst she pointed to the bed, then towards the bathroom with shuddering horror. Suddenly we were startled out of our compassionate sympathy by a piercing scream, and my thoughts flew instantly to the experiences of the former tenants, and what I myself had heard in passing on that June morning of the former year. The medium had turned at bay, and began a frantic encounter with some entity unseen by us. Wildly she wrestled and fought, as if for her life, whilst she emitted piercing shrieks for help. We rushed to the rescue, dragging her away from her invisible assailant, but a disembodied fighter has a considerable pull over a fighter in the flesh, who possesses something tangible that can be seized. I placed the medium behind me, with her back to the wall, but though I pressed her close, she continued to fight, and I had to defend myself as well as defend her. Her assailant was undoubtedly the first terrible entity which had controlled her. At intervals she gasped out, "Terrible doctor! Will kill me! He's killed master! Help! Help!" Gradually she ceased to fight. The soldier was exercising with all his force, and was gaining power. Finally he triumphed, inasmuch as he banished the terrible doctor. The medium was, however, still under the control of the broken-hearted entity, and began again to wander about the room. We extracted from her further details. An approximate date of the tragedy, her master's name, that he was mentally deficient when the murder took place. She was a maidservant in the house, and after witnessing the crime she appeared to have shared her master's fate, though by what means we could not determine. The doctor was a resident physician of foreign origin. At last we induced her to enter the bathroom, which she seemed to dread, and there she fell to lamenting over the dead body of her master, which had lain hidden there when the room was used as a large cupboard. It was a very painful scene, which was ended abruptly by her falling down insensible. She had collapsed in an awkward corner, but at last we lifted her out and carried her downstairs to the garden. When I tried to revive her with brandy, I found that her teeth were tightly clenched. I then tried artificial respiration, as I could feel no pulse. Gradually, she came back to life, quietly, calmly, and in total ignorance of what had occurred. The most amazing thing was that she showed no signs whatever of exhaustion or mental fatigue. We were all dead beat, but not so the fragile-looking little medium, though externally she looked terribly disheveled and draggled. This was the last time I set foot in the haunted house, which is now being demolished, but I still had to experience more of its odd phenomena. The date and names the medium had given us were later on verified by means of a record of villa residence, which for many years had been kept in the town of Torquay. There is no one left now who has any interest in verifying a tragic story supposed to have been enacted about 50 years ago. it must be left in the realms of psychic research, by which means it was dragged to light. Certain it is that no such murder came to the knowledge of those who were alive then, and live still in Torquay. If there is any truth in this story, it falls under the category of undiscovered crimes. The murderer was able somehow to hide his iniquities and escape suspicion and punishment. I do not know if it is intended to build another house on the same site. I hope not, for it is very probable that a new residence would share the fate of the old. Bricks and mortar are no impediment to the free passage of the disembodied, and there is no reason why they should not elect to manifest for an indefinite period of time. There can be no doubt that the scream was an actual fact. There are so many people living who heard it, and are willing to testify to the horror of it. Amongst those living people are former tenants, who for long bore the nervous strain of its constant recurrence. There remains one other weird incident in connection with Castel a Mare, which I will now try to describe. In the winter of 1917, I was engaged in war work, which took me out at night. Like every other coast town, Torquay was plunged at sunset into deepest darkness, save when the moon defied the authorities. The road leading from the nearest tramcar to our house was not lit at all, and one had to stumble along as best one could, even electric torches being forbidden. I was returning home one very dark, still night about 10:15, and being very tired, I was walking very slowly. Owing to the inky darkness, I thought it best to walk in the middle of the road, in order to avoid the inequalities in the footpath at each garden entrance to the villas. At that hour there was no traffic, and not a soul about. Suddenly, my steps were arrested by a loud knocking on a window pane, and I collected my thoughts and tried to take my bearings. The sound came from the left, where 2 or 3 villas stand close to the road. All I could distinguish was a denser blot of black against the dense surroundings, but by making certain calculations, I recognized that I stood outside Castel a Mare. The knocking on the pane lasted only a moment or two, and was insistent and peremptory. I jumped to the instant conclusion that someone was having a lark inside, and was trying to get a rise out of me. I was too tired to be bothered, and moved on again with a strong inclination towards my own warm bed, when the knocking rang out more peremptory than ever. It seemed to say, "Stop! Don't go on! I have something to say to you." Involuntarily, I stood still again, and wished that some human being would pass along the road. I really would not have cared who it was, policeman, soldier, maidservant. I would have laid hold of them and said, "Do you hear that knocking? It comes from the haunted house." Alas, no one did come. The night lay like an inky pall all about me, silent as the grave, save for that commanding order to stop, which was rapped upon a window pane whenever I attempted to move on. Though the being who thus sought to detain me could not possibly distinguish who I was, or whether my gender was male or female, he could certainly hear my footsteps as I walked, and the cool inconsequence of his behavior began to nettle me. I was about to move resolutely on when I heard something else. This time, something really thrilling. Peal after peal of light laughter, accompanied by flying feet. But such laughter! Thin, high treble laughter, right away up and out of the scale, and apparently proceeding from many persons. Such flying feet, racing, pattering, rushing feet, light as those of the trained athlete. I stood enthralled with wonder, for in the pitch-black darkness of that house, surely no human feet could avoid disaster. They were rushing up and down that steep, bare wooden staircase that I knew so well, and the laughter and the swift-winged feet sounded now from the ground floor, then could be clearly traced ascending, till they reached the 3rd and last floor. Tearing along the empty corridors, they began the breakneck descent again to the bottom, a pell-mell, wild rush of demented demons chasing each other. That is what it sounded like. I must have stood there for quite 10 minutes, longing intensely for someone to share in my experiences. But Torquay had gone to bed, and I felt it was time for me to do likewise. What could I make of the affair? Nothing. Rats? Rats don't laugh. Human beings having a rag and trying to scare the neighborhood? No human being could have run up and down that staircase in such profound darkness. It would have been a case of crawling up with a firm hand on the banister rail. I gave up trying to think and turned resolutely away. As I did so, the knocking began again upon the window pane. "Do stop! Oh, don't go away! Stop! Stop!" It seemed to call after me insistently as I quickened my footsteps and gradually outdistanced the imperious demand. What explanation have I to offer? None. The hallucinations of a tired woman? That may do for the general public, but not for me. You see, I was the person who heard it. There are many haunted houses that are quite habitable, such as Hampton Court Palace, etc., where the apparition keeps strictly to an anniversary, or where the phenomena are mild and inoffensive. Their presence can be endured with a certain amount of equanimity. The point really lies in this. Are the ghosts who haunt a dwelling indifferent to, or hostile to, the presence of their companions in the flesh? If the situation is according to the latter, then the ghosts will certainly score. They will rid themselves of the human inhabitants by a wearing down nerve pressure, which cannot be fought against with any chance of success. If the ghosts are shy or indifferent, wrapped up in their own concerns and containing themselves in a world of their own, then there is no reason why the incarnate and discarnate should not live peacefully together. Today, February 27th, 1919, I read the following in the Morning Post. Haunted or disturbed properties. A lady who has deeply studied this subject and possesses unusual powers will find out the history of the trouble and undertake to remedy it. Houses with persistent bad luck can often be freed from the influence. Strictest confidence. Social references asked and offered. What would our grandparents have thought of this means of turning an honest penny? I have no doubt the lady possessing the unusual powers will be employed, and in many cases she will be successful. In the majority of cases, I venture to say that she will fail, simply because the majority of cases are too elusive to be dealt with by human means. How would this lady treat the Castel a Mare scream? How would she deal with the next story I am going to relate? It is a simple matter to compile a book of thrilling ghost stories if direct evidence is not given, if names of persons and places are suppressed. I claim that my stories have a special interest and value, because I have tried to restrict them to such as can be attested to by living persons closely related to me either by friendship or by family ties. In a very few instances, I have been obliged, for obvious reasons, to suppress the names of houses and hotels. In these cases, I am ready personally to supply full information to genuine students of the occult, if they are willing to approach me privately. End of Chapter 21, the sequel. Read by Marissa D6, Largo, Florida, August 19th, 2023.
Chapter 22 of Ghosts I Have Seen and Other Psychic Experiences by Violet Tweedale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Piotr. Chapter 22 The Haunted Lodge. A considerable number of people are alive who can testify to the truth of the facts I now narrate. I regret that I have not been able to investigate this case personally, but I hope to do so before very long. In the spring of 1901, my sister and her husband, Major Stewart, rented an old shooting lodge in Argyllshire. The place was charmingly situated, the shooting and fishing excellent, and the scenery around was noted for its romantic beauty. Though the main portion of the house was old, a new wing had been added for the sleeping accommodation of servants, and this arrangement shut them off at night from the ancient part of the dwelling. The original kitchen still remained in use. The servants had been sent on in advance to prepare the lodge, and when Major and Mrs. Stewart arrived they were at once confronted with the information that the place bore a very evil reputation. the villagers had not hesitated to prime the maids with all sorts of creepy stories, eminently calculated to cause their precipitate departure. Luckily for the master and mistress, the maids had been with them for some years, and were neither of a timid age nor disposition, so the household settled comfortably down in those long spring and summer days which in the north means practically no darkness. My sister had banished the alleged hauntings from her mind, and probably the maids had done likewise, for all was going quietly and well, when suddenly, after a week's residence, there came a rude reminder. Major and Mrs. Stewart were both awakened one night by unmistakable sounds of very noisy burglars, who appeared to have broken into the house through the kitchen quarters. The Major lit a candle and looked at his watch. It was just on midnight. What puzzled them both was the noise the intruders made. Burglars naturally tread softly and stealthily, but these men stamped about in heavy boots and were engaged in throwing about heavy articles. There seemed to be quite a number of accomplices involved in the enterprise, and they displayed an amazing indifference to detection. My sister and her husband decided that events could not be left to take their course. This matter must be looked into. The Major armed himself with a loaded revolver. My sister armed herself with a lighted candle and a box of matches, and together they crept softly downstairs on their way to the kitchen. All this time the noises continued. Stamping of heavy feet, crushing down of heavy weights, but on the way downstairs a first glimmering that the supernatural came into this affair began to dawn upon my sister. She became aware that an invisible presence was following them. The noises continued as they cautiously and silently crept towards the kitchen. As they reached the door, suddenly utter silence fell. Inside nothing was disarranged. There were no signs of burglars. Everything was as usual. Considerably mystified, Major and Mrs. Stewart returned to bed and were not disturbed again that night. The next day, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the same sounds began again. This time the noise was easily located in one of the unused bedrooms on the top floor of the house. Heavily shod men were tramping about the floor overhead, throwing down heavy boxes and making a considerable disturbance. Major and Mrs. Stewart ascended on tiptoe, and when outside the closed door listened intently. There was no mistake this time. Nothing could sound more human than the activity going on inside that room. Half a dozen men, at least, were in possession of it, and those men had to be confronted. Luckily, they had no means of escape. This time they really would be caught. After a few minutes of silent listening, the Major, whose hand was on the knob, threw open the door and bounded into the room. Instant silence. Nothing. Not even the whisk of a defiant rat's tail. The husband and wife sat down and stared at one another in utter bewilderment. The bright spring daylight seemed to mock them as it flooded every chink and cranny. Shortly after this occurrence, 3 guests came to stay, 2 women and a man. They were given bedrooms on the top floor, but the room whence the disturbance had come was left severely alone. The household, with one accord, welcomed their advent as a pleasant distraction, and it was unanimously agreed that they should be kept in absolute ignorance of what had taken place. The next morning the 3 guests all had the same story to tell, of having had no sleep. Heavily booted men kept passing their doors, and heavy articles were flung about in adjacent rooms. They had spent a night of terror. No one had possessed sufficient courage to look out into the corridor along which the men were passing, and they had kept lights burning in their rooms till full daybreak. They refused to sleep again upon that floor. My sister moved them down to the 2nd floor, on which she herself slept, and a thorough investigation of the house, outside and inside, was made. No conclusion was come to. The noises continued on the following night, but being overhead and more distant, they were more endurable. A second male guest now arrived, and the assembled household waited in breathless interest to see how the ghosts would affect him. Nothing whatever was told to him, and he was lodged in a bedroom immediately underneath the noisy one. The next morning, after all had passed a disturbed night, it was found that some of the noises had proceeded from the new guest. He had carried some of his blankets out into the garden and had slept there. He remained on, but refused to sleep in the house, and a tent was rigged up for him outside. He stated that the disturbances were too much for his nerves, though he had no idea what they were. His behaviour on the first night, in retiring to the garden, was meant as a strong protest against such treatment of a tired guest. His temper had got the upper hand of him, after fruitless efforts to sleep, and finally he had tramped downstairs with an armful of blankets, anticipating many apologies next morning from host and hostess, and a peaceful night to follow. The following day a new maid arrived. She slept in the old part of the house, and shortly afterwards asked my sister if the house was haunted, as she had been kept awake by heavy people running past her door with naked feet. By this time it was only the influence of the staid old servants which prevented the younger ones from taking flight. My sister and her husband were not alarmed, they were profoundly interested. The summer passed on, and there were days and weeks when nothing was heard. Then, quite suddenly, the disturbances would begin again. As the noises sounded so very human, it was extremely difficult to believe that they really did not proceed from incarnate beings, and my sister told me that, time after time, as she listened, she would say to herself, "Now, beyond the shadow of a doubt, there are men in that room." She would creep upstairs, listen for some time with her hand on the doorknob, then suddenly throw it open, to find nothing. She never wearied of trying to surprise those invisible men. At times, when her husband was away from home, she would spend the entire night in an obstinate attempt to solve the mystery. When she had no guests, and the servants were asleep in their new wing, she would awake to the noise. Taking her candle, she would mount on bare, silent feet to the floor above, and listen at the door, often for half an hour at a time. She had no fear, but intense curiosity. It was easy to trace what was going on in the room. Men were packing, moving heavy boxes, throwing down heavy articles, walking about the floor with ponderous tread. First they would be on one end of the room, then move on to the other. Sometimes they approached so near the door behind which she stood that she expected to see it open and to be confronted by several burly ruffians. She would rush suddenly in, candle in hand, only to be received in sudden, utter silence. Not even the scurry of a scared mouse. After half an hour of patient waiting within the room, she would leave it, close the door, and sit down on the staircase. In a few moments the disturbance was again in full swing. Were I writing an account of these hauntings for the Psychical Society, I should go into the most minute details. Suffice it here to say that during all this time every sort of investigation had been carried out by practical men and women who had personally heard the disturbances and who were keenly interested in the phenomena. Rats were of course the first natural suggestion, but no one put forth this theory after having once, with their own ears, heard the disturbances. No one could advance any rational conclusion. The whole affair was baffling in the extreme. It would have been simple enough to leave the place and forfeit the rent, but my sister and her husband loved the sport and the beauty of the surroundings, and were determined to remain, unless anything worse developed. No one ever saw anything unpleasant, or even suggestive of the supernatural, and the whole household had become more or less indifferent to the noises. They brought no harm to anybody, and might be safely ignored. Mrs. Stewart had 4 Pomeranian dogs, which did not produce a calming effect upon their human companions. They were constantly seeing things, bristling and showing every sign of terror. Into the noisy room they refused to go, and they objected to being left a moment alone. They slept in my sister's bedroom. One night she was alone in the old house. Major Stuart had gone on business to Edinburgh, and the servants had retired to bed in their own wing. Mrs. Stuart was sitting in the smoking room, reading an interesting novel by the light of a lamp. A good fire burned, and the 4 Pomps were asleep on the hearthrug. The door was slightly ajar, and outside it ran a short corridor. Suddenly, at its far end, a terrible noise arose. A very different noise to anything that had been heard before, and one so blood-curdling that Mrs. Stuart at last knew the meaning of mortal fear. 2 men were fighting desperately, swaying and wrestling, and snarling fiercely like 2 tigers locked in deathly combat. She glanced at the dogs. They were sitting up, staring with terrified eyes at the door, their bodies quivering, their little fangs showing. Then, with a bound, they were off, tearing for dear life along the corridor towards the stairs. It was a situation that demanded considerable nerve. Impossible to sit there alone in the dead of night and listen to that hideous din but a few yards from the door. She must follow the dogs as swiftly as she dared. She took up the lamp and moved stealthily to the door. The corridor was in complete darkness, and in that darkness the 2 men fought desperately, and below their breath they raved, groaned, blasphemed incoherently, one long drawn-out babble of breathless discord. In an overwhelming rush of terror, Mrs. Stuart made a dash for the stairs, but while still in the corridor she heard flying feet approaching her from the end she was trying to reach. She shrank back against the wall. The flying feet passed in a wild, tempestuous rush, and as they did so the lamp was struck violently out of her hand, and she was left in complete darkness. She reached her bedroom and locked the door. Then she lighted the candles and looked for the dogs. She found them huddled together in abject terror under her bed. The next day my sister called upon the lady who owned the place, and recounting her experiences, asked to be told the origin of the hauntings. She was told the following story. Many years previously, a farmer, who was a widower, lived in the lodge with an only son, who was growing up. The old farmer married again, a pretty young girl, and the son fell in love with his stepmother. A quarrel ensued, and a desperate conflict, in which the father stabbed his son to death. The Stuarts did not leave the haunted lodge till some time after the events I have narrated. In fact, my sister inhabited after her husband died, during a stay in the south of England. It is difficult to form any conjecture as to the actual cause of the disturbance. How do ghosts contrive to make such a noise? The common answer would be they were astral noises heard clairaudiently. But was every one in the house clairaudient? It is possible, but most unlikely. When the noises began, every one under that roof heard them, and continued to hear them till they ceased. The lodge is still to let, so perhaps the mystery may yet be unravelled. Will a member of the Psychical Society not try his luck? The rent is low, the sport of more than one kind is excellent. In the course of time my widowed sister married again, and her second husband has given me a curious and gruesome story of an experience which came to him whilst he was still a bachelor. I will give it in his own words. About 14 years ago I retired from the London Stock Exchange, and owing to ill health I was advised by my doctor to take a long sea voyage. This advice I followed, and much benefited by rest and sea air I returned to London, after an absence of 9 months. Always having lived an active life, I could not contemplate settling down in utter idleness, and I consulted my solicitor on the subject of work. He told me that a client of his had just bought a flourishing and well-known mill in North Wales. He proposed to run it for a time alone, and then turn it into a company or syndicate, as he had not sufficient capital of his own to ensure its ultimate success. In due time my solicitor gave me a letter of introduction to this man, and I went to stay at his house close to the mill which he had just bought. It was a rambling old place, which in the good old days had been a coaching inn. Owing to bad management, the landlord had failed, and for many years it had stood empty and to let. It was a queer idea, I thought, to turn a coaching inn into a private residence, more especially as I soon heard that it had a very evil reputation. Though I made many inquiries in the neighbourhood, I could never get anything more definite than that there was some evil influence in the house. Everyone who lived in it came to a bad or violent end. I concluded that its proximity to his work caused the mill owner to purchase it, and I thought no more of the matter. If I was favourably impressed, my intention was to put a certain amount of capital into the concern and learn the trade. But after staying for a few days with the mill owner, I came to the conclusion that I would have nothing to do with so odd a person. He was of medium height and very thin, with rather straggling hair turning grey, and a sallow, hollow-cheeked face. He had a curious habit of glancing suddenly behind him, as if someone had just tapped him on the shoulder, and several other little traits bespoke an extreme nervousness of disposition. One night I entered a room where he happened to be, and discovered him staring at himself in a mirror. I suppose I exhibited some surprise, for he wheeled round on me and cried, "Well, how do you think I am looking?" Had I answered truthfully, I should have said, "Stark, staring mad." His face was ghastly pale, and his eyes were blazing. I made some careless reply, and shortly afterwards left the house to play a game of billiards with some acquaintances I had made. There I was given some interesting information. The mill owner was a declared bankrupt. I returned to the house at 10 o'clock, and at once retired to bed, without again seeing my unfortunate host. The next morning I was awakened at 7:30 by my hostess knocking at my door and inquiring if I had seen anything of her husband. I replied that I had seen nothing of him, but if she was anxious I would dress quickly and have a look around for him. This offer she accepted with gratitude. The station was not far distant, and she suggested that he might have taken the train to Manchester. Would I go and make inquiries? I was soon on the way, and interviewed a porter, who informed me he had seen the mill owner about an hour ago, not on the platform, but staring at the rails. The man had watched him, thinking his behaviour suspicious, and remembering the evil reputation of his dwelling. But after a while he had turned away, and was last seen walking rapidly off in the direction of his own home. I went back and reported what I had heard, and the very anxious wife suggested I should snatch a hasty breakfast and then make inquiries at a farm a mile off, which was also their property. This I readily consented to do. I was extremely sorry for the poor woman, and though she did not make a confidant of me, I could see she was consumed with anxiety. My errand was quite fruitless. Nothing was known of the master. No one had seen him, and back I went to the mill house, feeling by this time that probably the wife had every cause for her anxiety. I saw nothing of her when I entered. I looked into every room on the ground floor, and was just going to ring for a servant when I fancied I heard a faint cry. I went out into the hall and listened intently. The voice was calling from somewhere below the ground, and I thought at once of the huge cellars I had been shown, where once the good ale had been brewed and stored. I ran to the door which led to the cellars. It was open, and then I clearly heard a woman's voice crying, "Oh, bring a knife! Bring a knife, quickly!" I darted back into the dining room and caught up the first knife I could find, a ham carver, then hastened to the door and began descending the dark stairs. The cellars were fairly well lighted by two grated windows, and a horrible sight met my eyes. There stood the wife, bending under the weight of her husband, who was suspended by a rope round his neck from the great beam overhead. One glance at the hideously distorted face, the glazed eyes protruding from their sockets, the gaping mouth, and swollen tongue told me the worst. Hastily I severed the rope, and the wife and her dead husband sank to the ground together. There was little to be done. We laid the corpse flat on the stone floor, and I persuaded her to leave it and come upstairs with me and wait for the arrival of the doctor and police. This she consented to do. She was very quiet and composed. A curious apathy of indifference possessed her, and I would far rather have seen her in floods of natural tears. By evening the house had fallen into a dead silence. The doctor had pronounced life to be extinct, and the corpse had been carried up to an unused bedroom immediately over the smoking room. The police found that the mill owner had committed suicide by hanging. He had jumped off a stone slab after having adjusted the rope to the beam and his own throat. With the exception of an old nurse who was devoted to her mistress, the servants all departed in a body, and the house was left brooding under a weight of intolerable depression. I did not blame the servants. As a matter of fact, there was nothing I would have liked better than to quit the mill house there and then, and never set foot in it again, but I had the desolate widow to consider. I could not leave her alone, whilst there was still the smallest possibility of my being of use. Added to this, I had the queerest feeling that she required protection, though from what I would have been at a loss to say. Another feeling, which I combated violently, was a sensation of being mocked and jeered at by some unseen entity. I was being urged to get out of the house, to recognize my own impotence, to mind my own business, and when I metaphorically replied, "Get thee behind me, Satan," I could have sworn I heard a sly laugh. Of course, I told myself all this was but the result of a shock to the nerves, and I was not going to pay any attention to it. So despite my intense longing to run out of the house, I settled down with the daily paper, a cigarette, and a novel in the smoking room, and resolutely turned my thoughts away from the tragedy. The wife and her old nurse, who had promised me not to leave her mistress for a moment, had retired together for the night, so I felt satisfied so far as they were concerned. I suppose I must have dozed off, for I was suddenly roused broad awake by footsteps overhead in the room where the corpse lay. I sat up straight and listened intently. Were my nerves playing tricks with me? No, certainly not. There was no mistaking that sound for hallucination. It was perfectly clear and distinct. A man was walking about overhead, and the only man save myself within these walls had hanged himself by the neck until he was dead. There it was, the sound. A man's footsteps pacing slowly up and down the floor of the bedroom above, from end to end, backwards and forwards. I considered what I had better do. I was sure the widow and the old nurse were in the bedroom, quite at the other end of the house. Probably they were both asleep. I hoped so. What had I better do? Nothing? Yet this inaction irked me. My curiosity was intense. The supernatural had never occupied much of my thought, but now it began to do so. Those steps must proceed from the supernatural. There was no other explanation. I was the only live man in the house. At last I could stand it no longer. I jumped up and proceeded upstairs. The lights had been left to me to extinguish. They were still on, and I saw at once that the door of the bedroom was open. I entered the room, lit the gas, and searched every corner. No living thing was present. The dead man lay in rigid lines beneath a sheet. I left the room again in darkness, and carefully closing the door, I went softly along to the widow's room and knocked very gently. The old nurse came to the door. She told me her mistress was asleep, and that the doctor had given her a sleeping draught. Neither of them had left a room since they entered it to go to bed, more than an hour ago. I went downstairs again and took up the newspaper, but almost immediately the footsteps began once more overhead, in the room where the dead man lay. The sound was soft and stealthy at first, then it grew louder. The same footsteps moving about the floor, up and down, up and down. I am not ashamed to say that I felt a cold sweat break out all over me. I could not stand that sound any longer. I made up my mind to go to bed. I removed my shoes and turned out the light. As I did so, I could have sworn I heard a sly, low laugh behind me. I crept upstairs. The door of that horrible room was open again. With a shaking hand I closed it and hurried to my bedroom, locking the door at once. The next day I told my experiences to one of the acquaintances I had made, and he volunteered to come in and keep me company until the funeral was over. I gladly accepted his offer. I did not hear the footsteps again. I conclude because the widow was sitting with us on the following nights, and the ghost had no desire to terrify her. End of chapter 22, The Haunted Lodge.
Chapter 23 of Ghosts I Have Seen and Other Psychic Experiences by Violet Tweedale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in July 2023. Chapter 23, Auras. I was born with the power to see auras, and I have attained to quite a grown-up age before I discovered that everyone could not see them. What is an aura? You will see them glittering round the heads of saints and of the Christ in church windows. You will see them painted round the head of the Blessed Virgin, round the head of the infant she holds. But indeed, auras are the property of all, however humble and lowly. Nothing that has life, be the spark ever so faint, is without its astral counterpart, its tenuous surrounding atmosphere. Science has demonstrated this. Auras have now been photographed. Habitual seeing of human auras has made me no more or less observant of them than I am of the human face. If I am asked by anyone to say what her aura looks like, I do so to the best of my ability, but at that complacent moment it is a very tame affair, much like the aura that anyone may see surrounding a lighted candle. A medley of prismatic hues, no color predominating. Where auras become really interesting is in a room full of people. I look down to the far end of the room where a group is seated talking. I cannot hear what they are saying, but I can tell at once whether the conversation is harmonious or otherwise. Often there will be one member of the group whose aura is very disturbed. It will emit flashes of brilliant red as he talks vehemently. The aura of the man he is addressing has turned a sulky leaden gray. A woman who is sitting listening has an aura of intense boredom. The colors are all there, but they have become faded, and the extreme tips droop dejectedly, like so many wilted blades of grass. The biggest aura I have ever seen was that of the late Mr. Sexton, a great orator whom I once heard in the House of Commons. Some people have mean, tight little auras, others have great, spreading halos of brilliant light. I met with a very unusual aura quite lately. A young woman, Miss L., came to tea with me, a charming, cultured woman whose profession it is to keep a large girls' school. She is much interested in occult matters, and we got upon the subject of a rather wonderful case of spiritualism of which she knows the details, the medium being a young girl whom I will call Elsie. Whilst I was talking to Miss L., I could not help observing something very peculiar in her aura. It was all lopsided. In place of being a complete circle around her head, it had a huge bulge out to the left. I had never before seen an aura like that, and it interested me greatly. Just before leaving, she mentioned auras and asked me what hers was like. I told her honestly that it was peculiar, lopsided and bulging on one side. She laughed and said she knew that because Elsie always chaffed her about it, saying, "You wear your halo all awry."
This was very interesting confirmation of my power to see auras correctly. I don't know Elsie. I don't even know her name, which has been kept a secret, but we evidently see Miss L's aura in exactly the same peculiar form. The other day I was sitting reading by the window, and as I moved in my chair I caught sight, with the tail of my eye, of something bright at the other end of the room. A patch of light about a foot deep, 2 feet long, was coming from behind the edge of a tall screen that hid a door. I rose and walked out of the room. Behind the screen was a maid whom I had not heard enter the open door. She was busy over some quiet work, and it was her aura that I had seen, though she herself was hidden from view. Once before in my life, my attention has been drawn to the aura of one whom I could not at the moment see in the flesh. I happened to be passing a glove shop in the south of France, and as I strolled slowly past the door, a blaze of yellow gold inside the shop caught my eye and attracted my attention. I paused at once and looked through the open door. This great golden aura belonged to the Empress Elizabeth of Austria, who was standing at the counter. Her back was turned towards me, and I stood for a minute watching this aura of a woman whose restless imagination and passionate love for the bitter wine of liberty brought her finally to an absolutely fitting death. I believe she would have chosen this death before all others, for at heart she was a born anarchist. She fell painlessly by the dagger of anarchism. One effect of being able to see auras is that they fix certain incidents firmly in the mind. I remember one such incident very clearly. I was staying at Hawarden with the Gladstones, whilst the Irish troubles of '82 were at their height. One afternoon we were all assembled on the lawn having tea. Mr. Gladstone was standing rather apart, his hands full of papers, which had just been brought to him. I saw him unfold what looked like a large poster, glance at it, then suddenly he dashed it to the ground and stamped viciously upon it. I heard him give vent to some exclamations of intense anger, but had I heard nothing, I could not have failed to know he was desperately annoyed over something, for he was suddenly wrapped in a brilliant crimson cloud, through which sharp flashes like lightning darted hither and thither. He was seeing red. I remember Mrs. Gladstone murmuring something about posters being torn down in Ireland, but I was too thrilled over her husband's aura to pay much heed to what she said. I shall never forget that scene and the practical disappearance of Mr. Gladstone in the enveloping folds of a great red cloud. In a minute or two he emerged and resumed his habitual aura, which extended to about 2.5 feet beyond his head and was largely tinged with purple. At Hawarden Church on Sunday, whilst he read the lessons, I watched his aura with much interest, because it changed so continuously, and I discovered that this change arose out of his absorption in what he read. Only one little example can I remember to illustrate what I mean. Quote, "And the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he would not let the people go." End quote. In reading those words aloud, Mr. Gladstone's aura deepened to red, and I saw he was very indignant with Pharaoh's behavior. During the sermon, he sat facing us in our pew, and in a chair just beneath the pulpit, and I could tell by watching his aura just how he felt about the discourse. Later on, just after the tragic murders by the Fenians in Phoenix Park of Lord Frederick Cavendish and Mr. Bourke, I received a note from Mrs. Gladstone asking me to go to breakfast with them in their London house in Buckingham Gate. When I arrived, the first person I saw was Lady Frederick Cavendish, calm and composed, and bearing her loss with quiet stoicism, but the atmosphere of the house was very different from that of Hawarden. The gloom was over all, and for the first time I noticed that Mr. Gladstone's aura was depressed and tired. Its vigorous vibrations had considerably slowed down, like a jet of flame that had been turned low, and the extremities drooped dejectedly. Though crimson red is the color of anger, there is a beautiful soft rose, which is the color of love. The green-eyed monster of jealousy history has handed down to us from the ancient seers, also the jaundiced appearance of envy. A gloomy, grumbling person has a very leaden gray atmosphere, and one who has a fit of the blues shows he is off color in his dull, muddy blue aura. But there is a beautiful sky blue to be seen in the auras of many artists and scientists. Very material, earthly people have generally a deep, dull orange tinge in their astral envelope, and there is a glorious gold and yellow surrounding the heads of the spiritually joyful and highly intellectual. Purple is the color of power, greatness. Children have an aura of crystal whiteness, which develops color after the age of 7. I remember the aura of Frederick Myers very well, a large and intensely spiritual halo. He is the only man I can remember in those days, about 92 through 96, as having an aura within an aura, though this phenomenon is now becoming more marked. A rainbow was about his head. Those words explain exactly what I mean. About a foot above his head circled a pure rainbow, and this beautiful decoration looked as if it were superimposed upon the original aura, which streamed out far above it. I have only as yet, in these later years, seen this rainbow above the heads of 2 people, one alive, Miss Maud Royden, one, alas, gone west, the incomparable Elsie Inglis. I conclude it means a degree of self-sacrificing spirituality, which as yet has been attained to by very few. Indeed, I would venture further and assert that it stands for a certain initiation conferred upon the beloved by the Master of Wisdom. King Edward was blessed by a very fine aura of constantly changing colors. I remember once noticing this in the most unspiritual of environments, and whilst the king was still Prince of Wales. We were on Newmarket Heath, and His Majesty came up to me and said, "I hear you are married." After a few minutes of friendly conversation, which had taken an amusingly domestic turn, he said to me, "Now, how much has your husband got a year?" There was nothing in the question but the most friendly interest. Still, it will naturally seem strange that he should have possessed the faintest curiosity as to the financial situation of so humble a member of his people. Whilst he put the question and waited for the answer, his whole aura and atmosphere deepened and intensified. He was actually interested in my answer, and this, I have always believed, was the fundamental reason of his great popularity. The power he possessed of throwing himself heart and soul into the trivial, as into the great things of life. He was intensely human, with a genuine fund of sympathy for the ordinary affairs of life. He liked to know the domestic conditions of those whom he honored with his friendship, and the first time I ever spoke to him, at a dance given by the Rothschilds in Piccadilly, I saw at once that the natural human simplicities of life absorbed him absolutely whilst under discussion. Though a man who would not tolerate a liberty, the easiest way to get on with him when alone was to confide in him any personal difficulty, and to forget who he was, always providing that one had the good breeding to remember instantly that he was the king when speaking to him in public. The most occult day, to use the popular expression, I ever spent was the 26th of June, 1902, the day of the postponed coronation. I shall never forget that warm summer day of stupendous gloom and oppressive darkness. There was something more than meteorology in that leaden pall that hid the skies and enveloped the whole of London. Even the densest materialists were uneasy, startled, and inquiring, for putting aside that mighty aura of sorrow and gloom rising up to heaven from the hearts of millions, there was, as it were, the response of heaven herself. That dark and mournful response nature assumed when, wrapping herself in a shroud of leaden darkness, she brooded over the city like the pall of death itself. That day the mystic walked in a dream, enmeshed in the warp of great occult happenings, being woven out in the loom of karmic fatality. It was impossible to settle down to doing anything. One just sat about, living every moment intensely. Once, when presenting a girl at court during the present reign, I noticed what a very striking aura John Burns possesses. This girl naturally wished to see all she could. So we went to the palace very early and found a seat in the throne room, close to where the king and queen would sit later on. In a short time, celebrities began to stroll into the royal circles, divided from us by a cord. First came the present Lord Grey of Felladin, and then came Mr. John Burns, resplendent in dark blue knee breeches and gold-embroidered coat. He moved about quite familiarly inside the Holy of Holies, speaking first to one, then to another of the gathering little crowd. Being so close to him, I observed him with unusual interest. His aura is very large, and what I can only describe as massive, and already it was tinged by the gray veil of disappointment. I have seen him several times since, and the veil has become more opaque. What interested me so profoundly in him that night were the contrasts I knew to exist in his life, and which must have profoundly influenced his outlook on human existence. One afternoon I was walking alone up Piccadilly. There had been rumors of coming riots, but no one in the West End gave any credence to such silly stories, and the streets were full of the usual gay throng, intent on amusement. Suddenly, as I walked along, a youth on a bicycle dashed past the pavement, shouting something I could not catch. More men on bicycles followed. The promenaders began to sit up and take notice. Carriage horses were being smartly whipped up, and women began to scurry nervously. Then it seemed to me I could hear something above the roar of the ordinary traffic, a hoarse, prolonged shout. Servants now appeared on doorsteps and looked about anxiously for non-existent policemen. Others began closing outside shutters before windows. Just as I reached the Naval and Military Club, I saw that the servants had come out and were about to close both great gates, in and out. One of these men pointed up the street and advised me at once to seek cover, and I saw in the dim distance what looked like a mighty crowd advancing. In a second I had darted through the gates and was safely inside before they closed upon the approaching mob. I have only a very confused memory of what happened after, of kindly attentions from the members, of women's shrieks as their carriages were stopped and their valuables taken from them, of the deafening roar of furious male voices, crashings of glass windows, howls of savage exultation as a hosier's shop close by fell victim to the rioters, the clatter of hoofs from terrified horses. I could see nothing, but the battering upon the club gates added tenfold to the terrifying din. The members withdrew, taking me with them to the house, and prepared to hold it against the furious mob should the gates give way. Such wild moments are not easily forgotten, and why I looked upon John Burns that night at court with such a peculiar interest was because he led that riot and suffered imprisonment for doing so. Looking upon him in court dress, in the royal enclosure, on intimate terms with the great of the world, though perhaps not the great of the earth, knowing him to hold high office in the government, I marked the change. Then, throwing back my mind to those poignant hours in the past which he had created, I felt that nothing is too extraordinary to belong to the careers of some men. They live through several lives in one. Their karma is so crowded with stirring events in the working out of the past, in the makings of the future, that nothing human can be any longer strange to them. The auras of such men are naturally great, because such contrasts of light and shade only come in the lives of men possessed of great and lofty ideals. For some years little has been heard of the former idol of Battersea. He is facing west now, though a ray or two of dawning light may still touch him in the near future. That wild idealism which comes to men who keep their eyes fixed upon a dawn so long in coming fades out behind the veil of disillusion, as the days come not and the years draw nigh with no pleasure in them. Man's ingratitude to man is one of the cruelest tests imposed upon the soul of idealism. The soul that can bear it without a tinge of cynicism has risen to mighty heights. Such grandeur of soul was possessed by Elsie Inglis. So impregnated was she with pure love of humanity that when her own country virtually turned its back upon her, this irreparable disgrace brought upon themselves by her own people cast no shadow upon her soul. In the years before the war, I often noted her lovely aura as I sat amongst an audience and watched her on a platform fighting woman's battle. After the war broke out, I only saw her once, by the merest chance. It was then I marked that a rainbow was now about her head, and I knew at once that tremendous events were in store for her, though the British government had refused her services. Ah, the poor little cramped mind of England's officialism! Yet has not this very poverty of imagination, this iron-bound worship of worn-out tradition, brought to birth an internationalism which could never have been ours without it? It drove forth hundreds, thousands of ardent souls to other lands. Rejected by their own, they clasped the pierced hands of strangers and laid down their own incomparably gallant lives at the foot of a cross, whereon hung those who had at length become their brothers through a commune of agony. Elsie Inglis received no honor or decoration from the people or the great of England. Only the body, worn very thin in the service of humanity, was at last honored in death. Knowing the woman and the stuff she was made of, one can only feel intensely this was all as it should have been. To offer Elsie Inglis a medal would have been a sacrilege. Hands off such souls as hers, is the cry one's every instinct rings forth to the bauble worshippers of this world. Besides, and this is a very great besides, those who go with a rainbow about their heads are not destined for earthly honors. They have taken the great step, they have received the great initiation, a jewel in the blazing crown of eternity, and for them no more are the laurel wreaths that perish. In justice to those throned on high on earth, the above should be remembered. If it is with Elsie Inglis, as I fully believe, she would have understood that for her God and Mammon were eternally divorced, and any attempt at worldly recognition would have been frustrated by the lords of eternal light and wisdom, whose chosen disciples she had become. The psychology of the people is a very interesting and curious study to the aura-seer. The analysis of the collective mind awaits some great writer who will give us a book of absorbing interest. Those who can see auras have a great advantage if they are public speakers. During the period of my life when I had a great deal of political platform work, I was always very sensitive to my audiences because I could see how they were taking my remarks. I have always found big audiences of the people very colorless in the main. Flashes of bright color would be apparent all over the hall, but there was no sustained glow. Whilst sitting on someone else's platform, often that of a great orator, I have marked exactly the same phenomenon. The soul of the people is still young and childlike. It has the indifference of extreme youth, the forgetfulness and ingratitude of extreme youth. I look back upon the fall of Parnell and Dilke, great minds whose earthly careers were destroyed by the people. All the world knows why. Today I look on the perpetrators of the Gallipoli and Mesopotamia tragedies, and I see they have all gone up higher in the esteem of the people. They have risen in the world and are looked upon as ripe for even higher office. The poor human brain reels before such anomalies. I was in London when the Gallipoli reports were given to the public. They shook me to the very foundation of my being. I think they were given out towards the end of the week, because I remember saying to myself, on Sunday morning, the British working man and woman will read all this abomination of desolation and crime in their Sunday paper. Purposely, I strolled about the London parks in the lovely afternoon on that Sunday. Crowds were there, reading, courting, sleeping. I went home realizing that no one cared. The collective aura of the people was as serene and as indifferent as ever. I have come to think more kindly of our people's pathetic indifference, because I am sure it is the indifference of very young souls, who have passed through but few incarnations and know not what they do. I see them exploited by the politicians, given a rag doll to amuse themselves with, anything will do, from the big loaf to the Kaiser, and sent to the polls hugging their gollywog, but I doubt the returning troops being so easily amused and deluded. The state of the universe is the expression of man's desire, and man is really the builder of his own body, that house not made with hands, though in his youthful ignorance he attributes both to an overruling intelligence, whom he alternately blesses and curses. When men learn that they must work with and not against the mental laws, they will no longer ask why God permits the world to be so full of misery. They will cease to erect a scapegoat, because they will have learned that they are the makers of their own misery or happiness. Many people seem to think that the power to see auras must be very useful in helping one to distinguish between friends and foes, but such is not really the case. Auras exemplify individual character, not individual predilections, and some of my friends, being very bad characters indeed, have shocking auras. I had one great friend who, at the beginning of our acquaintance, spent much of his time in prison, which was really a blessing for his ill-used wife. His aura was literally in tatters, just a little irregular circle of rags and patches. I had just succeeded in making him sober by insisting constantly and most seriously that he was a cut above the public house, and much too superior a man to mix with such degraded companions, when the war broke out. He went to the front, and on his first return to Blighty, badly gassed, he came at once to see me. I really felt a sort of personal pride in him, and an actual sense of personal possession in his enormously grown aura. It was clear evidence of his sprouting soul. He went back to France, but was wounded and again gassed, and this time his return was final, as he was of no further use. For a few months he did odd jobs with great difficulty. Then, finally, he succumbed to pneumonia. I was very proud indeed of his aura as I sat beside his bed, his hand in mine. There was real love in my heart for him that day. Here, indeed, was an infant soul that had begun to develop on the right road, and the tattered aura of rags and patches had become a neatly trimmed little halo round his poor tired head. So he went west, and his broken body, wrapped in the British flag, went to a soldier's grave, and a firing party gave him the last post. His wife returned home to find that her neighbors, anxious to celebrate the occasion, had brought their best china and had arranged a tea party. As we sat down, she turned to me and said, "Well, thank God, my man's been buried like a gentleman." When I came to think it over, I arrived at the conclusion that the worst character in the slums had not done so badly with his life after all. He had died like a gentleman. The British flag is a strange case of transubstantiation. At first, just so many pieces of common material sold across the counter. Fashioned into the emblem of our nation, it becomes a sacred symbol, taken kneeling like a sacrament, which indeed it has become. What better shroud could any man ask for? I am sorry that I have had no opportunity of seeing President Wilson's aura, the man who has turned his face towards a heavenly ideal and is scattering the seed amongst all the nations. When a man sets out on such a long, radiant path, he will carry visibly in the daylight an illuminated brow. He has brought to us the vision without which the people perish. The life of the heart has always meant much more to me than the life of the head. The rebel by nature can only be held by love, and I have been blessed by 28 years of perfect union with one who has given me love for love, faith for faith, and complete intellectual understanding. My life has also been wonderfully gifted by staunchest friends who have loved me through sunshine and storm, and who still clasp hands with me across continents and seas. I suppose I must have enemies. They say everyone has, but they have never made me aware of their enmity, perhaps because there is no room in a very full heart to receive aught but love. If I were to single apart one outstanding feature in my life, it would be the wonderful kindness and friendship that has been given to me. Ah, how easy that makes it to write lovingly of others. Behind all this lies the master passion of the born mystic for liberation, the constant ache and urge for real freedom and power to be victorious over all circumstances. At home in all scenes, restful in all fortunes, there is the urge of the soul for universality of contact with all humanity, independent of race, color, or creed, the urge of the spirit to smash the confines which pinion it down to earth. I think it is really the urge of reincarnating life still clinging to me. The knowledge that my immortal soul must return to the house of bondage until perfection is reached and there is going out no more from the Father's house from a freedom which has become supreme. End of chapter 23, Auras.
Chapter 24 of Ghosts I Have Seen and Other Psychic Experiences by Violet Tweedale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 24, Adieu. Today there are many, an ever-swelling number, who behold with joy the gates ajar, who, standing in the twilight, catch momentary glimpses of dawn upon the horizon of time, who know by personal experience that they have come into touch with a region where vast schemes are conceived, and universal laws of boundless magnitude connected with the soul's eternal pilgrimage are carried out. Again, there are others, timid, shrinking souls, to whom, by a mere chance combination of circumstances, a glimpse has been shown which is none too welcome. Such affrighted ones drop the eyelids from the startling vision. They will have none of it, and they are free to accept or reject, go on or stand still. Others, again, have actually been born with that supernormal sight, which can discern the workings behind the drop scene shrouding the stupendous drama of cosmic government. I have long been conscious that the veil has worn very thin between myself and another world lying around me. As the years draw swiftly on, and every second thrown back into eternity brings me nearer to blessed deliverance, I find the rents in the veil grow more numerous. They bring single shining moments which reveal the spirit of life, its motives and consecration. Through the driving storm rack there will come quite suddenly a brilliant heavenly glimpse. It never lasts long, but long enough to show me reality, something of the vastness of cosmos and the pathetic minuteness of this earth, just a speck of stardust in the palm of God, an atom of world stuff swinging in boundless space. Something of the reality of those shining ones who guide the progression of natural order, embodiments of resistless energy and of stateliest imperial mien. Glimpses that show to me what was in the mind of the great Christian mystic when he wrote of a mighty angel. A rainbow was upon his head, and his face was as it were the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire. Behind such visions extend vast ranges of being, quite outside my ken, yet nevertheless speaking to me of things. For the expression of which no words have yet been coined, infinitely greater than anything that can be said, significant in meaning beyond expression, and far transcending imagination. Such glimpses show to me lives that, as compared with ours, are as hours to the teeniest insect afloat for an hour on the breath of the south wind, lives which ordain the fateful hour when the rise and fall of empires, the destruction of nations, and the clash of worlds, and their cosmic significance in world history shall begin or end. Where things life promised but never gave come to full fruition. Other glimpses and echoes from the great beyond bring to me the answer to a problem, a few notes and a new melody, a new energy of hope and love, an inspiration from the great brotherhood whose lowliest disciple I am, whose work to establish the brotherhood, the true affinity of humanity upon earth, I hold most dear, most high. In the present dark hour, all the world is drinking of one chalice, its wine the life outpoured for others. All humanity is partaking of one bread, a body which has most truly and literally been given to be broken. Death has left many songs unsung. A myriad graves are filled. Youth is blighted in the bud. In this white winter men call death, and its cup is pressed close to the lips of love. Many are the hopes that lie folded away in the quiet cemetery of the heart, where we lay flowers of tender reminiscence. Yet this sacrament of fellowship, which is eclipsed in the awful impoverishment of human life, will one day be swelled by the return of the young, fallen on the field of honor, glorified and purified for their God-appointed work in evolution. Perhaps I have gone a few steps farther than most people into the mysterious beyond, come nearer reading the great riddle, for the creature who is not afraid of thought and worldly condemnation, who is not afraid of solitude or ridicule, will soon come near the truth, will quickly catch the incommunicable thrill of advancing destinies. She will cease to live under the despotism of days, the tyranny of years. She will know that the swiftest touch cannot put a finger on the present, and that there is but one recorder of time, the great star clock of the sky. The symbol of life is the circle, not the straight line, and each of us lives over again the story of humanity, as in the shadow of prenatal gloom, we repeat the physical evolution of the race. The increase of knowledge but widens the horizon of the unknown promised land, to which we are moved onward and upward throughout the ages. However far the mind travels, there is always deep down in the soul stores of information awaiting transference to the surface of consciousness. Rich mines of knowledge are there awaiting the day when they will be uncovered, waiting in patience the day when some divine adventurer will search for them and bring them to light. However great its aspirations, the soul but looks out upon an illimitable horizon and sees the human pilgrimage as a long Emmaus walk, with hearts burning by the way. Always there must be mystery in life, because life is spiritual, not material. The presence of mystery in life is the presence of God, and the infinity of God shows us that mystery must always exist. Such glimpses beyond the veil are all transfiguring. They exalt the heart in a single flash to a glow point, and show the soul of the universe in the incandescent crucible of the eternal. In a deeply beshadowed time, such visions tell us all that we need to know, and it is this: God is with us and in us. Though obscure for the moment, his transcendence stands outside the change and flux of time, and his awful sovereignty sways irresistibly the tides of human circumstances. Hours must come when the pen falls from the nerveless fingers. The task is left undone when the weary cry goes up. There is nothing we can do. We have been doing for so many thousand years, the years which the locusts hath eaten. What have we achieved? When such hours come, as come they must, is there nothing to fall back upon but this awful confession of failure, this haunting undertone of all our mortal life that many ages have not hushed? Surely, yes. There is always, for the mystic, the unmeasured immensity of soul land to explore, that great beyond and within, which is infinite, eternal, and of which we are all a part. Ah, but it may be said all are not mystics, to which I would reply, all who desire can be mystics. For what, after all, is a mystic but one who enters into possession of the inner life, one who becomes fully aware of her self-consciousness, and who gains thereby new faculties and enlightenment. It places her in touch with that supreme reality which some call God, and some the great creative power. The mystic knows that power is to be found within through identification and submergence with the primordial force which constitutes the ocean of life. She can always pass the sky and clouds of earth and enter the great, deep, real world outside. It is always possible to her to seek a fairer world where the only things that matter are the eternal verities, which should be taken kneeling like a sacrament. Love and life, which is beauty, love and power, which is goodness, love and knowledge, which is wisdom. The road of the flaming Sacred Heart is strewn with insight, kindness, and sympathy, which gives eyes to the blind, ears to the deaf, and a voice to the dumb. It is paved with love that serves the humble and defends the disinherited. Bravely it walks the Via Dolorosa, and it beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things. Its reward? To know the love of God, unutterable even to them that know. The mystic can face the future without fear, for the power has been given her to take her soul and, like a carrier dove, loose it into space, to speed away into the fathomless, the everlasting, the voiceless deep, whose silence is the welcome home of God. End of chapter 24. Adieu. Read by Aaron Zimmerman. End of Ghosts I Have Seen and Other Psychic Experiences by Violet Tweedale.